I arrived at my parents' luxurious suburban home for Christmas Eve dinner, with my son Tyler expecting the usual family gathering. Instead, my father Harold blocked Tyler at the door, declaring, "Losers aren't welcome for Christmas," after discovering Tyler is taking prerequisites at community college instead of going directly to a prestigious university. My mother Patricia nodded approvingly, while Tyler's cousin Brad smirked and added, "This is just embarrassing." I watched my 18-year-old son's face crumble as my family humiliated him, publicly feeling my protective instincts surge. The cold December air bit at our faces as we stood on the front porch of my childhood home, the warm yellow glow from inside mocking the frigid reception we were receiving. Harold's voice carried that familiar tone of superiority that had made my teenage years miserable, but hearing it directed at Tyler made my blood boil in ways I had never experienced. "You heard me correctly, Katie." Harold continued, his 6-foot frame blocking the doorway completely. "We don't reward failure in this family, and we certainly don't celebrate it during the holidays." Tyler's shoulders sagged beneath his carefully chosen Christmas sweater, the navy blue one, with the small reindeer pattern that he had picked specifically because he thought his grandmother would find it charming. I watched him fidget with the wrapped present in his hands, a handmade photo album filled with his academic achievements and volunteer work from high school. "Dad, what are you talking about?" I managed to ask, though my voice sounded strange and distant. "Tyler's done nothing wrong." Patricia appeared behind Harold, her perfectly styled silver hair catching the porch light. She wore her expensive burgundy dress, the one she reserved for special occasions, when she wanted to remind everyone of the family's financial status. Her lips were pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "Nothing wrong," she repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "Katie, your son is attending community college. Community college. Do you understand how that reflects on our family name, or—" I felt Tyler stiffen beside me, and I could practically hear his heart breaking. This was supposed to be a celebration, a time for family and love and gratitude. Instead, my parents were treating my brilliant, hard-working son like he had committed some unforgivable sin. "We've been preparing for this conversation for weeks," Harold announced, and something cold settled in my stomach. "Your mother and I have discussed this extensively. We cannot continue to pretend that Tyler's choices are acceptable." "Preparing?" I echoed the word, feeling foreign on my tongue. Patricia stepped forward, her expensive perfume mixing with the scent of pine and cinnamon wafting from inside the house. "We've spoken to the entire family, Katie. Everyone agrees that tough love is what Tyler needs right now." My heart hammered against my ribs as the implications of her words sank in. "Everyone—" "Your brother Mark is inside with Jennifer and Brad," Harold explained with satisfaction. "They understand our position. Brad has been accepted to Yale's pre-med program with a full scholarship. He's what we call family material. Tyler, on the other hand—" He gestured dismissively at my son, who stood frozen beside me like a deer caught in headlights. Tyler's dark eyes, so much like his father's, were filling with tears that he was desperately trying to hold back. "We even prepared a proper place setting," Patricia added with cruel efficiency. 5 places for 5 family members. Tyler simply doesn't qualify for inclusion tonight." The front door opened wider, and I could see into the dining room where the antique mahogany table gleamed under the crystal chandelier. 5 plates were indeed set with my mother's finest china, the pattern with the delicate blue roses that had been passed down through generations. 5 sets of silverware, 5 cloth napkins, 5 wine glasses. The absence of a 6th setting felt like a physical blow. "You planned this," I whispered, understanding flooding through me like ice water. "You actually planned to exclude him." "We planned to teach him a lesson," Harold corrected. "Sometimes reality is the best instructor." Brad's voice drifted from inside the house, loud and confident, as he described his latest academic achievement to someone. My nephew had always been the golden child, the one who met every expectation and exceeded every goal. But hearing his success used as a weapon against Tyler made me want to scream. "Tyler works harder than any of us," I said, my voice gaining strength. He's maintained a 4.0 GPA while working 3 jobs. He's more dedicated than most adults I know. Dedication to mediocrity is still mediocrity, Patricia replied smoothly. We've been telling our neighbors that Tyler is taking a gap year to figure himself out. It's been quite embarrassing when they ask follow-up questions. Tyler made a small sound beside me, somewhere between a whimper and a gasp. I looked at him and saw that his face had gone completely pale, his freckles standing out starkly against his skin. The photo album in his hands was shaking. We've also been in contact with the neighbors about their children's college acceptances, Harold continued. The Hendersons' daughter got into Princeton. The Murphys' son is attending Harvard Medical School. When people ask about Tyler, he trailed off meaningfully, letting the implication hang in the air like smoke. You've been lying about him. I realized my voice barely above a whisper. We've been protecting the family reputation, Patricia corrected, which is more than you've been doing as his mother. The words hit me like a slap across the face. 20 years of feeling inadequate in my parents' eyes came rushing back, every criticism and disappointed sigh echoing in my memory. But this wasn't about me anymore. This was about my son, my sweet, brilliant, hard-working son who deserved better than this cruelty. We're leaving, I announced, reaching for Tyler's arm. No, Harold said firmly. You're welcome to come inside, Katie. You're our daughter, and despite your poor choices, we love you. But Tyler needs to learn that actions have consequences. Perhaps spending Christmas alone will motivate him to make better decisions about his future. The suggestion that they expected me to abandon my son and enjoy dinner while he sat alone somewhere was so outrageous that I couldn't immediately respond. The audacity of it rendered me speechless. He's not family material anymore, Patricia added with finality. Not until he proves he can live up to our standards. Tyler dropped the photo album and it hit the concrete porch with a soft thud. The carefully wrapped package split open, revealing pages of his achievements scattered across the ground. Academic awards, volunteer certificates, recommendation letters from teachers who believed in him. The wind caught some of the papers, sending them skittering across the lawn like fallen leaves. And that was when Harold delivered the final blow. We're also removing Tyler from our will, he announced with satisfaction. Consider it tough love for a failure. The warmth that escaped through the open door felt like mockery against my frozen face as Harold's words echoed in my ears. Tyler bent down to gather the scattered papers from his ruined photo album, his movements mechanical and defeated. I wanted to help him, to shield him from this humiliation, but I was paralyzed by the sheer cruelty of what was happening. You can't be serious, I managed to say, though my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. We've never been more serious, Patricia replied, adjusting her pearl necklace with manicured fingers. Come inside, Katie. Let's discuss this like adults while Tyler learns an important lesson about consequences. Against every instinct screaming at me to grab Tyler and run, I found myself stepping over the threshold. I needed to understand the full scope of this betrayal to know exactly what my family had done to my son. Tyler followed behind me, clutching the damaged photo album to his chest like armor. The inside of my childhood home looked exactly as it always did during the holidays. Garland draped the banister of the curved staircase, and the 14-foot Douglas fir dominated the living room corner, decorated with ornaments collected over decades. The smell of roast turkey and homemade stuffing filled the air, creating a perfect Norman Rockwell scene that felt completely surreal given the circumstances. Mark emerged from the kitchen carrying a bottle of wine, his face lighting up when he saw me. My younger brother had always been the peacekeeper in our family, the one who smoothed over conflicts and found middle ground. Surely he would be reasonable about this situation. Katie, great timing, he said warmly. Then his expression shifted when he noticed Tyler hovering uncertainly by the door. Oh, I thought we discussed the seating arrangement. My heart sank as I realized that Mark was not only aware of the plan to exclude Tyler, but had actively participated in it. Jennifer appeared next, My sister-in-law's blonde hair perfectly styled despite spending the day cooking. She gave me a bright smile that faltered when she saw Tyler. "Sweetie, maybe Tyler would be more comfortable at home tonight," Jennifer suggested gently. "This is really more of an adult conversation anyway." "Adult conversation," I repeated numbly. Brad bounded down the stairs with the confidence that only came from never having faced real disappointment. At 19, he was tall like his grandfather, with the same commanding presence and easy smile. He had inherited the family's natural charisma along with their sense of entitlement. "Aunt Katie, perfect timing," he said enthusiastically. "I was just telling everyone about my research opportunity at the medical center. Did you know I'll be working directly with the head of cardiology next semester?" He didn't acknowledge Tyler's presence at all, as if my son had become invisible. Tyler stood near the entryway like a ghost, haunting his own exclusion, still holding the remnants of his photo album. "We should all sit down," Harold announced, gesturing toward the living room. "Katie needs to understand why we've made these difficult decisions." The living room furniture had been rearranged to create a semicircle facing the fireplace, with Harold's leather chair positioned like a throne at the center. It felt disturbingly like an intervention or a trial. I took a seat on the sofa, and Tyler perched uncomfortably on the edge beside me, ready to flee at any moment. We've been discussing Tyler's situation for months. Patricia began settling into her favorite armchair with practiced elegance. Ever since we learned about his college choice. Months. I asked, feeling like the air was being sucked from the room. Mark nodded solemnly. "We're worried about you, Katie. About both of you, really. Tyler's decision to attend community college reflects poorly on our family's values and expectations. But more importantly," Jennifer added, her voice dripping with false concern, "we're worried that you're enabling his mediocrity. Sometimes love means setting boundaries." I looked around the room at these people who had been my support system my entire life, searching for any sign of the warmth and acceptance I remembered from childhood Christmases. Instead, I found cold calculation and barely concealed contempt. "We've been very discreet about this," Harold assured me. "We've told people that Tyler is taking a gap year to mature and reconsider his options. It's saved the family considerable embarrassment." Tyler made a small sound of distress, and I saw his hands trembling as he clutched the photo album. My protective instincts flared, but I forced myself to remain calm and gather information. "What exactly have you told people?" I asked carefully. Patricia produced her phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be a lengthy list of notes. "Well, the Hendersons asked about Tyler's college plans at the grocery store last month. I told them he was exploring different paths and taking time to find himself. The Murphys inquired at church," Harold added. I explained that Tyler was considering trade school as a more realistic option given his limitations. The word limitations hit me like a physical blow. Tyler had graduated valedictorian from his high school class of 400 students. He had received multiple academic awards and had been accepted to several four-year universities. His only limitation was our family's financial situation after his father left us with nothing but debt. And when Mrs. Chen asked about his SAT scores at the country club, Mark continued, "Mom told her that we prefer not to discuss disappointing results." Tyler's SAT score had been in the 98th percentile, higher than Brad's score, though we had never made comparisons. But apparently, my family had been actively spreading lies about my son's abilities and achievements for months. "You've been sabotaging his reputation," I said quietly, the full scope of their betrayal becoming clear. "We've been managing a difficult situation," Patricia corrected. "Do you have any idea how humiliating it is to admit that our grandson chose community college over proper universities? People make assumptions about family values based on those choices." Brad shifted in his chair, looking uncomfortable for the first time since we had arrived. "Maybe we could talk about this after Tyler leaves," he suggested awkwardly. "No," Harold said firmly. "Tyler needs to hear this. He needs to understand how his decisions affect the entire family." Jennifer nodded in agreement. We've always been supportive of Tyler, but support doesn't mean accepting failure. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is refuse to enable poor choices. I wanted to point out all of Tyler's accomplishments to list every award and achievement he had earned through hard work and dedication, but I could see that my family had already made up their minds. They had constructed a narrative where Tyler was a disappointment, and they were determined to stick to that story regardless of evidence to the contrary. We've also been discussing your parenting choices. Katie. Patricia continued, her voice taking on a sharper edge. A single mother raising a son without proper male guidance inevitably leads to these kinds of problems. The criticism of my parenting felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I had sacrificed everything to give Tyler the best life possible after his father abandoned us. I had worked multiple jobs gone without necessities and dedicated every ounce of my energy to ensuring my son had opportunities and support. Tyler's father leaving was the best thing that ever happened to us, I said, quietly, surprising myself with the vehemence in my voice. Was it? Harold challenged. Because from where we're sitting, the results speak for themselves. Tyler stood abruptly, the photo album falling from his lap and scattering more papers across the Persian rug. I should go, he said, his voice cracking with emotion. Sit down, Harold commanded, his voice sharp enough to make Tyler flinch. We're not finished. My son slowly sank back onto the sofa, his face pale and drawn. I could see tears threatening to spill over, and every maternal instinct I possessed was screaming at me to get him out of there immediately. We've prepared something that might help Tyler understand our perspective, Patricia announced, producing a manila folder from beside her chair. She opened the folder and pulled out several sheets of paper, each one covered in neat handwriting and what appeared to be printed emails and documents. My stomach dropped as I realized what I was looking at. These are Brad's achievements from his first semester at Yale, she announced with pride. Dean's List research opportunity leadership position in his pre-med society, and a recommendation from his organic chemistry professor for accelerated placement. She spread the papers across the coffee table like a winning poker hand, each document highlighting Brad's success in vivid detail. Then she produced another folder, this one noticeably thinner. And these are Tyler's community college transcripts and course listings. She continued, her voice dripping with disappointment. Basic biology, introductory chemistry, general education requirements that most students complete in high school. The comparison was designed to be humiliating, and it worked perfectly. Tyler stared at the contrast between his cousin's achievements and his own modest course load, his shoulders sagging with shame. Do you see the difference? Harold asked pointedly. One grandson is excelling at an elite institution, building a foundation for medical school and a prestigious career. The other is repeating high school coursework at a community college. What they didn't understand, what they refused to acknowledge, was that Tyler's path was not a reflection of his ability, but of our financial reality. Community college was a strategic choice that would allow him to complete his prerequisites without accumulating crushing debt, giving him a better foundation for medical school applications. But explanation felt pointless in the face of such willful ignorance. We love Tyler, Jennifer said softly, but love sometimes means setting boundaries. We can't continue to pretend that all choices are equal when they clearly are not. Mark nodded in agreement. We've talked about this extensively as a family, Katie. We think the kindest thing we can do is stop enabling Tyler's denial about his situation. Denial. I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Denial about his intellectual limitations, Patricia clarified. Denial about realistic career expectations. Denial about the importance of family reputation and standards. Tyler made a choked sound that might have been a sob, and I felt something break inside my chest. These people who were supposed to love and support him were systematically destroying his confidence and self-worth. We're removing Tyler from family events until he demonstrates real improvement in his choices and attitude, Harold announced with finality. No more birthday celebrations, no more holiday gatherings, no more family vacations. He's welcome to return when he's ready to meet our expectations. The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fireplace and Tyler's barely audible breathing. Outside, snow had begun to fall, coating the windows with a thin layer of white that made the warm room feel even more isolated from reality. "This is not negotiable," Patricia added. "We've discussed it thoroughly and we're all in agreement. Even Brad supports our decision." I looked at my nephew, who had the decency to appear ashamed of his complicity. But shame was not the same as courage, and he remained silent as his grandparents systematically destroyed his cousin's sense of belonging and worth. The most devastating part was not just the cruelty of their decision, but the calculated nature of it. This was not a moment of anger or disappointment that could be forgiven and forgotten. This was a deliberate campaign to exclude and humiliate my son, planned and executed with cold precision. And as I sat in that room surrounded by my family, I realized that Tyler and I were completely alone. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire ready to snap, broken only by the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the occasional pop from the fireplace. Tyler sat rigid beside me, staring down at the scattered comparison papers that painted him as a failure. His breathing had become shallow and rapid, and I could practically feel the walls closing in around him. "I want to say something," Tyler said suddenly, his voice so quiet we all had to strain to hear him. Harold leaned back in his leather chair with the satisfied expression of someone who believed they were about to witness a well-deserved surrender. "Go ahead, son. We're listening." Tyler cleared his throat and straightened his shoulders, summoning courage from somewhere deep inside. When he looked up, his dark eyes were filled with tears, but his voice was steady. "I chose community college because I researched the most financially responsible path to medical school." He began each word carefully measured. "The average medical student graduates with over $200,000 in debt. I wanted to minimize that burden by completing my prerequisites at a lower cost." Patricia's perfectly penciled eyebrows rose skeptically. "That sounds like rationalization to me." "It's not rationalization," Tyler continued, his voice gaining strength. "I spent months researching medical school admissions requirements and talking to current medical students about their experiences. Every single person I spoke with advised taking prerequisites at community college to reduce overall debt." Brad shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly very interested in examining his fingernails. I suspected he was beginning to understand that his cousin's choice was actually more strategic than his own expensive path. I also spoke with 3 admissions counselors at medical schools. Tyler pressed on, warming to his topic. They all said that where you take prerequisites matters far less than your GPA and MCAT score. A 4.0 GPA from community college is better than a 3.5 GPA from an expensive university. Harold's expression was darkening by the minute. This was not the broken apology he had been expecting. "Furthermore," Tyler said, his confidence growing, "I've been working 3 part-time jobs while maintaining perfect grades. I work at the campus tutoring center where I help struggling students with biology and chemistry. I work weekends at the medical equipment supply company where I've learned about hospital operations and medical technology. And I work evenings at the veterinary clinic where I've gained hands-on experience with medical procedures and patient care." The room had fallen completely silent. Even the fire seemed to have stopped crackling. "Those jobs aren't just about money," Tyler continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "They're about building experience and understanding the medical field from multiple perspectives. I've learned more about medicine and patient care in the past 6 months than most pre-med students learn in 2 years of classroom theory." I felt a surge of pride so intense it made my chest ache. My son was defending himself with intelligence and grace, presenting facts instead of emotions, logic instead of pleas. But Harold was not impressed. "That's a very pretty speech," he said dismissively, "but it doesn't change the fundamental reality. You're attending community college because you couldn't get into a real university." "That's not true," Tyler said quietly. "I was accepted to State University with a partial scholarship, and I was accepted to the honors program at Regional University with a full academic scholarship. The admission hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. I watched as my family processed this information, their carefully constructed narrative beginning to crumble around them. "Then why didn't you accept?" Jennifer asked, confusion evident in her voice. Tyler looked down at his hands, and I could see him struggling with whether to reveal the truth. When he looked up again, his eyes found mine, and I saw the pain and love and determination that had carried him through so many challenges. "Because my mom has been struggling financially since Dad left," he said simply. "She's been working 2 jobs to keep us afloat, and she's been putting money aside for my education, even though I know we can't afford it. I chose community college so she wouldn't have to sacrifice anymore for my dreams." The words hit the room like a physical blow. I felt my face burning with shame and pride in equal measure. Shame that Tyler felt responsible for our financial situation, and pride that he had chosen sacrifice over prestige to protect me. "Mom's been skipping meals to save money for my textbooks," Tyler continued, his voice breaking slightly. "She's been wearing the same winter coat for 5 years because every spare dollar goes toward my future. She sold her engagement ring last year to pay for my SAT prep course, and she doesn't know that I know about it." Tears were streaming down my face now, and I couldn't have spoken even if I had known what to say. Tyler had been protecting me just as fiercely as I had been trying to protect him. "So when people ask me why I chose community college," Tyler said, looking directly at Harold, "I tell them it's because I'd rather graduate debt-free than burden my mother with loans she can't afford. I tell them it's because I'm mature enough to prioritize substance over status." Brad finally looked up from his hands, his face flushed with what might have been embarrassment or admiration. But Harold's response was swift and brutal. "That's exactly what I mean about making excuses," he said coldly. "Real men don't whine about difficult circumstances. They overcome them." The words hit Tyler like a slap, and I watched my son's newfound confidence crumble in real time. "Real men don't blame their mothers for their limitations," Patricia added with cutting precision. "They take responsibility for their own failures." Tyler's face went white, and his hands began trembling again. The courage that had carried him through his defense evaporated in the face of such calculated cruelty. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry I'm not good enough. I'm sorry I'm embarrassing the family. I'm sorry I'm not like Brad." "Don't apologize to us," Harold said with satisfaction. "Apologize to your mother for putting her in this position. Apologize to your cousin for making his achievements look bad by comparison." Brad finally spoke up, his voice strained. "Grandpa, maybe that's enough." "No," Harold snapped. "It's not enough. Tyler needs to understand that his choices affect everyone around him. His mediocrity reflects on our family name, our reputation, our standing in the community." Tyler doubled over slightly as if he had been punched in the stomach. When he looked up again, his face was streaked with tears. "I've been working 60 hours a week while carrying a full course load," he said brokenly. "I haven't had a day off in 6 months. I study until 2 in the morning and get up at 6 for my shift at the clinic. I'm exhausted all the time, but I keep going because I want to make everyone proud." "Well, you've failed," Patricia said with clinical precision. "We're not proud, we're embarrassed." The words hung in the air like poison, and I watched my son's spirit break in real time. Tyler had poured his heart out, had explained his sacrifices, and his reasoning had shown them the depth of his love and dedication, and they had used it all against him. "I've been planning to change my last name after I graduate," Tyler said suddenly, his voice hollow and defeated. "I didn't want to embarrass the family anymore. I figured if I wasn't really part of it, then my choices wouldn't reflect on anyone else." The admission hit me like a physical blow. My son had been planning to erase his connection to us entirely, rather than continue to disappoint his grandparents. "I've been thinking about cutting contact with everyone after I turn 18. He continued, his voice growing smaller with each word. "Maybe if I just disappeared, you could all pretend I never existed. Then Brad could be the only grandson, and you wouldn't have to be ashamed anymore." Harold leaned forward with interest rather than concern. "That's actually not a terrible idea," he said thoughtfully. "A clean break might be best for everyone involved." Patricia nodded in agreement. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is let people find their own level without the pressure of family expectations. I stared at my parents in complete shock. They were actually entertaining the idea of my son removing himself from their lives entirely. They were discussing his self-imposed exile like it was a reasonable solution to their embarrassment. "I could change my name to my mom's maiden name," Tyler offered desperately, "or I could just use a completely different name. Whatever would be easier for the family." "Tyler, stop," I said, finally finding my voice again. But he was beyond hearing me. The dam had broken and years of feeling inadequate were pouring out. "I know I'm not smart enough." He continued, his voice cracking with emotion. "I know I'll never be good enough. I know I'm a disappointment and a burden and an embarrassment. I just want to stop hurting everyone by existing." The room fell silent except for Tyler's quiet sobbing. My 18-year-old son, who had worked harder than any adult I knew, who had sacrificed his own comfort for my financial stability, who had chosen responsibility over prestige, was apologizing for his existence. And my family was letting him. "Perhaps that's enough self-pity for one evening?" Harold said finally, his voice devoid of any warmth or compassion. "Tyler, you're welcome to leave now. Katie, you're welcome to stay for dinner." The suggestion that I would abandon my son and enjoy a meal while he suffered alone was so outrageous that I couldn't immediately process it. But as I looked around the room at these people who had raised me, who were supposed to love us both, I realized that they genuinely expected me to choose them over Tyler. They expected me to sacrifice my son for their approval. And in that moment, sitting in the living room where I had opened Christmas presents as a child, surrounded by people who had once made me feel safe and loved, I finally understood exactly who my family really was. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me, as the full weight of what I had just witnessed settled into my bones. Tyler remained curled into himself on the sofa, his quiet sobs the only sound in the suddenly oppressive room. The grandfather clock continued its relentless ticking, marking seconds that felt like hours as I processed the magnitude of my family's betrayal. "You want me to stay for dinner?" I said carefully, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears, "while my son goes home alone on Christmas Eve." Patricia smoothed her burgundy dress and nodded as if this were the most reasonable request in the world. "Tyler has made his choices, Katie. Now he needs to live with the consequences. But you're always welcome here. You're our daughter." The word daughter felt like acid on my tongue. What kind of daughter would they expect me to be if I abandoned my child for their comfort? "We've prepared your favorite dessert," Jennifer added helpfully. "That chocolate trifle you used to love as a teenager. I thought it might help you remember what it feels like to be part of a real family celebration." A real family celebration. The words echoed in my head as I looked around the room at these people who had systematically destroyed my son's self-worth and were now expecting me to thank them for it. "We understand this is difficult," Mark said gently, his voice taking on that same condescending tone I remembered from childhood arguments. "But sometimes love means making hard choices. Tyler needs to learn that his actions affect other people." I almost laughed at the irony. They were lecturing me about how actions affect other people, while completely ignoring how their actions were affecting Tyler. "What about how your actions are affecting him?" I asked quietly. Harold's expression hardened. "Our actions are intended to help him grow up and face reality. Your actions have been enabling his delusions and mediocrity." "My actions," I repeated, feeling something cold and dangerous stirring in my chest. "Yes," Patricia said firmly. "Your parenting choices have led directly to this situation. A single mother trying to raise a boy without proper masculine guidance inevitably produces these kinds of problems." The criticism of my parenting hit me like a physical blow, but this time I didn't absorb it quietly. This time I felt anger rising up to meet it. What exactly have I done wrong as a parent? I asked, my voice gaining strength. "You've coddled him," Harold replied immediately. "You've made excuses for his limitations instead of pushing him to exceed them. You've let him settle for less instead of demanding excellence. You've failed to provide proper male role models," Patricia added. "Boys need strong masculine figures to teach them about competition and achievement. Without that guidance, they become weak and entitled." "Entitled?" I asked, thinking about Tyler's 60-hour work weeks and perfect grades. "He thinks he deserves respect and inclusion regardless of his performance," Jennifer explained. "He thinks showing up is enough, that effort matters more than results." I stared at her in complete disbelief. Tyler had consistently delivered exceptional results while working harder than any teenager should have to work. But somehow, my family had twisted that into evidence of entitlement. "We blame Tyler's father for abandoning his responsibilities," Mark said solemnly. "But we also blame you for not finding a suitable replacement. Tyler needed a strong stepfather to teach him about excellence and accountability." The suggestion that I should have married someone for Tyler's benefit rather than for love was so deeply offensive that I struggled to find words. They were criticizing me for prioritizing my son's emotional stability over their social expectations. "We've been discussing your situation as a family for quite some time," Patricia continued, her voice taking on that clinical tone she used when delivering particularly harsh judgments. "We're concerned that your protective instincts have become counterproductive." "Counterproductive how?" I managed to ask. "You've sheltered Tyler from natural consequences," Harold explained. "You've worked multiple jobs to support his dreams instead of letting him face the reality of his limitations. You've made sacrifices that enabled his unrealistic expectations." I thought about all those sacrifices they were criticizing. The meals I had skipped so Tyler could eat, the overtime shifts I had worked to pay for his textbooks, the winter coats I had mended instead of replacing so that money could go toward his future. "Those sacrifices were motivated by love," I said quietly. "They were motivated by guilt and overcompensation," Patricia corrected. "You felt guilty about the divorce, so you tried to make up for Tyler's father's absence by being both mother and father. The result is a confused young man who doesn't understand his place in the world." The analysis of my motivations was so far from reality that I almost couldn't respond. I had made sacrifices because I loved my son and wanted him to have opportunities, not because I felt guilty about anything. "We're not trying to hurt your feelings, Katie," Jennifer said gently. "We're trying to help you see the situation clearly. Sometimes love means setting boundaries and allowing natural consequences to teach important lessons." "Natural consequences," I repeated slowly. "Tyler chose community college over real universities," Mark explained. "The natural consequence is exclusion from family events that celebrate academic achievement. It's not cruel, it's logical." I looked over at Tyler, who was still sitting hunched over on the sofa, his face hidden in his hands. My brilliant, hard-working, kind-hearted son, who had sacrificed his own comfort to protect me from financial strain. "We've also been concerned about your influence on Tyler's decision-making," Harold continued. "Your financial struggles have created a scarcity mindset that prevents him from pursuing excellence." "Scarcity mindset," I echoed. "He's so focused on saving money that he can't see the bigger picture," Patricia explained. "Sometimes you have to invest in quality to achieve real success. His penny-pinching approach to education will limit his opportunities in the long run." The irony was staggering. They were criticizing Tyler for being financially responsible while ignoring the fact that his caution was born from watching me struggle to keep us afloat after his father left us with crushing debt. "We think it might be best if Tyler spent some time away from your influence," Harold announced suddenly. "Perhaps a military school or structured program where he could learn discipline and realistic expectations." The suggestion hit me like ice water. They weren't just planning to exclude Tyler from family events, they were planning to separate us entirely. "Military school," I whispered. "Or perhaps he could live with his father for a while," Patricia suggested. "Learn some hard lessons about self-reliance and personal responsibility." Tyler's father had abandoned us when Tyler was 10 years old, leaving behind only debt and broken promises. He had remarried within a year and started a new family, showing zero interest in maintaining a relationship with Tyler. The suggestion that Tyler should live with a man who had rejected him was breathtakingly cruel. His father wants nothing to do with him, I said, my voice cracking with emotion. Perhaps that would motivate Tyler to become more worthwhile, Harold replied with cold logic. Nothing teaches a young man about excellence like being forced to earn approval from a demanding father figure. I stared at my father in complete horror. He was suggesting that Tyler should be emotionally abused and rejected as a form of character building. We're also concerned about Tyler's influence on Brad, Jennifer added suddenly. Brad has been asking questions about community college and wondering if he should consider a more affordable path. We can't allow Tyler's mediocrity to contaminate Brad's excellence. The fear that Tyler's practical wisdom might influence Brad to make financially responsible choices was apparently more threatening to them than Tyler's emotional well-being. Brad is already enrolled at Yale, I pointed out. Yes, but he's been questioning whether the debt is worth it, Mark explained. Tyler's example of settling for less is making Brad wonder if he should transfer to a state school to save money. The horror of it was becoming clear. They weren't just punishing Tyler for his choices. They were afraid his intelligence and maturity might influence Brad to make similarly wise decisions. We need Tyler to understand that his choices don't exist in a vacuum, Patricia concluded. When he settles for mediocrity, it affects everyone around him. When he chooses community college over real universities, it sends a message that excellence isn't important. I looked around the room one more time, taking in the faces of people who had been my support system for 37 years. People who had celebrated my birthdays, attended my graduation, comforted me during my divorce. People who had held Tyler as a baby and taught him to ride a bicycle and cheered at his baseball games. And now they were systematically destroying him in the name of family values and social expectations. I understand now, I said quietly, and I saw relief flash across several faces. But they had misunderstood my meaning entirely. I understood that my family's love was conditional on meeting their expectations. I understood that their support came with strings attached and could be withdrawn at any moment. I understood that they valued appearances more than actual character status, more than kindness and conformity, more than integrity. Most importantly, I understood that Tyler and I were not safe here. We never had been. Good, Harold said with satisfaction. Then you understand why Tyler needs to leave and why you should stay for dinner. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is allow people to face the natural consequences of their choices. I reached down and touched Tyler's shoulder gently. He looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes, his face streaked with tears and filled with shame that he had never earned. We're leaving, I said simply. Katie, don't be dramatic, Patricia sighed. Tyler can go home and think about what we've discussed. You don't need to leave with him. Yes, I said, helping Tyler to his feet. I do. And for the first time that evening, I felt completely certain about something. I was choosing my son over their approval, and it felt like the first honest decision I had made in years. Tyler and I gathered the scattered papers from his photo album in tense silence, while my family watched from their semicircle of judgment. Every photograph and certificate felt heavier in my hands as I realized these achievements meant nothing to the people who should have celebrated them most. The weight of their disapproval pressed down on us like a physical presence, making even the simple act of walking toward the door feel monumental. You're making a mistake, Katie, Harold called after us, his voice carrying that familiar tone of authority that had intimidated me throughout childhood. Tyler needs to learn that running away doesn't solve problems. I paused at the front door, my hand on the brass handle that I had touched thousands of times growing up. For just a moment, I felt the pull of old patterns, the desperate need for my father's approval that had shaped so many of my decisions over the years. We're not running away, I said without turning around. We're choosing dignity over cruelty. Patricia's voice followed us onto the porch, sharp with frustration. Don't be so dramatic, Katie. We're trying to help Tyler become a better person. Sometimes love requires tough decisions. The cold December air hit us like a slap as we stepped outside, but it felt cleaner than the poisonous atmosphere we were leaving behind. Snow continued to fall, creating a thin white blanket over the perfectly manicured lawn and expensive cars parked in the circular driveway. Tyler walked beside me in silence, clutching the damaged photo album against his chest like a shield. His breathing was still uneven from crying, and I could see him struggling to process what had just happened. We had both entered that house expecting love and acceptance, and instead we had found calculated cruelty disguised as family values. As we reached my car, I heard the front door open behind us. I turned to see Mark jogging down the porch steps, his face flushed with either exertion or embarrassment. "Katie, wait." He called his breath, forming small clouds in the frigid air. "Can we talk for just a minute?" Tyler looked up at me with exhausted eyes, and I could see him steeling himself for another round of criticism. But something in Mark's expression seemed different from the cold dismissal we had just experienced. "Get in the car and warm up," I told Tyler gently. "I'll be right there." My son climbed into the passenger seat without argument, and I watched him turn up the heat and pull his jacket tighter around himself. Even through the car windows, I could see his hands shaking, whether from cold or emotional trauma. Mark approached me carefully as if I were a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. When he spoke, his voice was lower than it had been inside the house, meant only for my ears. "I wanted you to know that not everything you heard in there was completely accurate." He began glancing nervously back at the house, where warm light still spilled from the windows. "What do you mean?" I asked, though something cold was already settling in my stomach. Mark looked around the empty street as if checking for witnesses before continuing. "Mom and Dad have been more involved in Tyler's situation than they let on tonight. They didn't just spread rumors about his college choice." The words hit me like ice water. "What are you saying?" "They contacted his high school guidance counselor last spring." Mark admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "They told her they were concerned about Tyler receiving too much encouragement for unrealistic goals." I stared at my brother in growing horror as the implications of his words sank in. They interfered with his college applications. They didn't think of it as interference. Mark said quickly, as if that somehow made it better. They thought they were protecting him from future disappointment by encouraging more realistic expectations. My hands clenched into fists at my sides as I processed this betrayal. Tyler's guidance counselor, Mrs. Rodriguez, had always been one of his strongest advocates. She had helped him research scholarship opportunities and had written glowing recommendation letters for his applications. If my parents had convinced her to undermine his efforts, what exactly did they tell her? I asked, my voice deadly quiet. Mark shifted uncomfortably, clearly regretting his decision to share this information. They said that Tyler had unrealistic expectations about his academic abilities. They suggested that his test scores might have been inflated or that his grades didn't reflect real understanding. The systematic nature of their sabotage was becoming clear, and it was far worse than I had imagined. They had not only embarrassed Tyler socially, but had actively worked to destroy his educational opportunities. They also called the State University Admissions Office. Mark continued, his voice growing even quieter. They said they had concerns about a scholarship recipient and wanted to share additional information about his character. I felt the world tilt slightly around me as I understood what he was telling me. Tyler had been accepted to State University with a partial academic scholarship that would have covered most of his tuition. He had been thrilled about the opportunity, spending hours researching their pre-med program and planning his course schedule. Then suddenly, and without explanation, the university had contacted him to say that his scholarship was being re-evaluated due to new information about his application. They had never provided specifics, and Tyler had been devastated by what seemed like a random administrative decision. They cost him his scholarship. I whispered, the pieces finally falling into place. Mark nodded miserably. They told the admissions office that Tyler had misrepresented his volunteer work and that his academic achievements were the result of grade inflation rather than real ability. Tyler had spent 2 years volunteering at the local animal shelter working with injured and abandoned pets while learning basic veterinary skills. He had also tutored struggling students at his high school, helping dozens of classmates improve their grades in math and science. The suggestion that he had misrepresented these experiences was not just false, but deliberately malicious. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, though I was not sure I wanted to hear the answer. Mark looked back at the house again, then met my eyes with an expression I had never seen before. "Because I have kids too, Katie, and if someone did this to my children, I would want to know." The admission that he had watched my parents systematically sabotage Tyler's future while saying nothing was almost as devastating as the original betrayal. Mark had known exactly what they were doing and had chosen silence over intervention. "Why didn't you stop them?" I asked, my voice cracking with emotion. "I tried to talk them out of it," Mark said defensively, "but they were convinced they were doing the right thing. They said Tyler needed to learn that excellence requires sacrifice and that protecting him from natural consequences would only hurt him in the long run." Natural consequences. There was that phrase again used to justify deliberate sabotage and cruelty. Dad also contacted the regional university. Mark continued, apparently deciding to confess everything now that he had started. He told them that Tyler had been accepted under false pretenses and that the family had concerns about his readiness for academic challenges. Regional University had offered Tyler a full academic scholarship based on his test scores and grades. It would have covered tuition, room, and board, and even provided a modest stipend for books and supplies. Tyler had been over the moon about the opportunity, seeing it as validation of all his hard work and dedication. Then, just like with State University, the offer had been suddenly withdrawn due to irregularities in the application process. Tyler had been heartbroken, convinced that he had somehow made a mistake or failed to meet some requirement he had not understood. He destroyed every opportunity Tyler had. I said the full scope of Harold's campaign becoming clear. "Not every opportunity," Mark corrected quietly. Community college was never contacted because Dad didn't think it mattered. He figured if Tyler was determined to settle for mediocrity, then mediocrity was what he deserved. The casual cruelty of that decision was breathtaking. Harold had systematically destroyed Tyler's chances at the universities that had recognized his potential while leaving him only the option that he could then use as evidence of Tyler's inadequacy. "There's more," Mark said reluctantly. "Mom has been talking to people at her church about Tyler's situation. She's been asking for prayers for a grandson who has lost his way and needs guidance back to the path of righteousness." The idea that Patricia had been using Tyler's college choice as a prayer request, painting him as a troubled young man who needed spiritual intervention, was so deeply humiliating that I felt physically sick. "She's also been discussing the situation with her book club," Mark continued. "She tells them that modern parenting has become too permissive and that children like Tyler are the inevitable result of not setting proper boundaries." My mother had been using my son as a cautionary tale, spreading intimate details of our family situation to anyone who would listen, while positioning herself as the wise grandmother, trying to save a wayward child. "And Dad has been talking to his business associates about the importance of maintaining family standards," Mark added. He uses Tyler as an example of what happens when families lower their expectations to accommodate mediocrity. Harold owned a successful construction company and was well connected in the local business community. The idea that he had been publicly humiliating Tyler in professional settings while discussing family values and personal responsibility made my blood boil. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, though I was not sure I wanted to know. Mark looked deeply uncomfortable as he considered the question. Since Tyler's junior year of high school, when he started talking about college plans, it escalated after he chose community college over the remaining options. 2 years. For 2 years, my parents had been systematically undermining my son while pretending to love and support him. They had sabotaged his opportunities, spread lies about his character, and used his situation to enhance their own sense of moral superiority. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because I kept hoping they would stop," Mark admitted. "I thought once Tyler proved himself at community college, they would recognize their mistake and apologize. I never imagined it would escalate to tonight." The idea that this evening's cruelty was an escalation rather than an aberration was almost too much to process. This was not a moment of poor judgment or temporary disappointment. This was the culmination of a long-term campaign to destroy Tyler's confidence and drive him away from the family. "Dad's been telling people that Tyler's failures reflect poorly on his parenting," Mark continued. "He says that grandfathers have a responsibility to correct mistakes that parents are too blind to see." The hypocrisy was staggering. Harold was publicly criticizing my parenting while secretly sabotaging Tyler's opportunities, creating the very problems he then claimed to be addressing. And Mom's been suggesting that Tyler might benefit from military school or some other structured environment where he could learn discipline and realistic goal setting, Mark added quietly. The suggestion that my academically successful, hardworking, responsible son needed to learn discipline was so ridiculous that it would have been laughable if it were not so malicious. "They've also been discussing the possibility of having him evaluated by a psychologist," Mark said. "They think he might have learning disabilities or emotional problems that explain his poor decision-making." The plan to pathologize Tyler's practical wisdom and financial responsibility was the final piece of their comprehensive assault on his character and future. I looked through the car window at Tyler, who was sitting quietly with his head leaning against the cold glass. My brilliant, kind, hard-working son, who'd been carrying the weight of his grandparents' disapproval and sabotage for 2 years without understanding why his opportunities kept disappearing. "I should have told you sooner," Mark said quietly. "I'm sorry, Katie, I really am." But his apology felt hollow and meaningless in the face of 2 years of silence, while Tyler suffered. Mark had watched my parents destroy my son's opportunities and had chosen family loyalty over basic human decency. "I need to go," I said, turning away from him. "Katie, wait," Mark called after me. "What are you going to do?" I paused with my hand on the car door handle and looked back at my brother, seeing him clearly for the first time in my life. "I'm going to protect my son," I said simply, "since no one else in this family will." And as I climbed into the car beside Tyler, I realized that I finally understood exactly what kind of people I was dealing with. They had not just excluded Tyler from Christmas dinner. They had spent 2 years systematically destroying his future while pretending to love him. And they were about to learn that they had made a terrible mistake. The drive home was silent except for the gentle hum of the heater and the soft sound of Tyler's breathing as he stared out at the snow-covered streets. I kept glancing at him from the corner of my eye, watching the way he hunched his shoulders, as if trying to make himself smaller and disappear entirely. Every few minutes he would wipe his eyes with the sleeve of his Christmas sweater, the one he had chosen so carefully because he thought it would make his grandmother smile. When we pulled into our small driveway, Tyler made no move to get out of the car. He sat motionless, still clutching the damaged photo album, staring at our modest 2-bedroom house with its cheerful Christmas lights blinking in the darkness. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said suddenly, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry I ruined Christmas. I'm sorry I'm such a disappointment." The words hit me like physical blows, each apology driving home how thoroughly my family had convinced him that their cruelty was somehow his fault. "Tyler, look at me," I said, gently, waiting until his dark eyes met mine. "You have nothing to apologize for. Nothing that happened tonight was your fault." "But they're right," he whispered. "I am a failure. I couldn't even get into a real university, and now I'm embarrassing everyone by pretending I can become a doctor." The self-doubt in his voice was devastating because I could hear echoes of Harold and Patricia's poison in every word. They had planted seeds of inadequacy that were now growing into full-blown self-hatred. "You are not a failure," I said firmly. "You are one of the most successful people I know, and I'm not saying that because I'm your mother. I'm saying it because it's true." Tyler shook his head sadly. "Mom, you don't have to lie to make me feel better. I know what I am." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced down to see Patricia's name on the screen, and my stomach immediately tightened with dread. "Who is it?" Tyler asked, noticing my expression. I hesitated, not wanting to expose him to any more toxicity from my family, but something told me that hiding their continued harassment would not protect him in the long run. "It's your grandmother," I said carefully. "She's asking if we want to come back for dessert." Tyler's face crumpled with a mixture of hope and fear. Even after everything that had happened, part of him still desperately wanted his grandparents' acceptance and love. "Maybe I should apologize," he said quietly. "Maybe if I promised to try harder to be better." "Tyler, no," I said firmly. "You are not going back there to be abused again." But my phone was buzzing again with another message, then another. Patricia was not giving up easily. Tyler reached for my phone before I could stop him reading the messages with growing distress. "She says they saved my favorite cookies," he said, his voice filled with longing. "She says they want to give me another chance to make things right." I took the phone back and read the full string of messages, my anger building with each manipulative word. Patricia was using Tyler's love for his family and his desperate need for approval to lure him back into their trap. "We should go back," Tyler said suddenly, his voice gaining urgency. "I can do better. I can make them proud." "How, I asked gently. "How can you do better than perfect grades while working 3 jobs?" Tyler thought for a moment, his face scrunched in concentration as he tried to solve an impossible puzzle. "I could transfer to State University next year," he suggested desperately. "I could take out loans and pay them back later, or maybe I could work more hours and save up enough to afford the tuition." The fact that he was willing to sabotage his own financial future just to earn his grandparents' approval broke my heart completely. "I could change my major." He continued his ideas, becoming more frantic. "Maybe medicine isn't realistic for someone like me. I could study business or accounting or something more practical." "Tyler, stop," I said, reaching over to take his hands in mine. "You are not changing anything about yourself to accommodate their cruelty." But Tyler was spiraling now, his need for family acceptance overriding all logic and self-preservation. "Maybe I could live with Dad for a while," he suggested, echoing Harold's earlier recommendation. "Learn some discipline and responsibility. Maybe if I became more like what they want." The idea that Tyler would voluntarily submit himself to his absent father's indifference just to win his grandparents' approval was so heartbreaking that I felt tears threatening again. My phone buzzed with another message, and this time Tyler grabbed it before I could react. His face went white as he read whatever Patricia had written. "What does it say?" I asked, though I was dreading the answer. Tyler handed me the phone without speaking, his hands trembling slightly. The message was longer than the others, written with Patricia's characteristic blend of false concern and subtle manipulation. "Tyler, your grandfather and I have been talking, and we realized that tonight was very difficult for you. We want you to know that our love for you hasn't changed, even though we're disappointed in your choices. If you're willing to have an honest conversation about your future and consider some alternatives to your current path, we'd be happy to include you in our Christmas celebration. We've always believed in second chances for people who are truly ready to grow and change." The message was perfectly crafted to make Tyler feel like his grandparents' cruelty was actually loving concern, and that their acceptance was still possible if he would just abandon his dreams and submit to their expectations. "See," Tyler said desperately, "they still love me. They want to give me another chance." "Tyler," I said carefully, "what do you think they mean by considering alternatives to your current path?" He was quiet for a moment, thinking through the implications. "Maybe they want me to look at different career options or different ways to pay for school." Or maybe they want you to give up on medical school entirely, I suggested gently. Tyler's face fell as the reality of their conditional love began to sink in. But if that's what it takes to be part of the family again? No, I said firmly. Being part of a family should not require you to abandon your dreams. But Tyler was already pulling out his own phone, his fingers moving quickly across the screen as he composed a response to Patricia's message. "What are you writing?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "I'm telling them I'm willing to listen to their suggestions." Tyler said, his face filled with desperate hope. "I'm telling them I want to be better." I watched my son sacrifice his dignity and self-worth for the possibility of his grandparents' approval, and I felt something break inside my chest. Tyler had been so thoroughly conditioned to believe that love was conditional on performance that he was willing to negotiate away his entire future for their acceptance. "Tyler, wait," I said, reaching for his phone. "Let's think about this for a minute." "Mom, please," he said, pulling the phone away from me. "This might be my only chance to fix things. I can't lose my family." The desperation in his voice was unlike anything I had ever heard before. Tyler was terrified of being alone, of being permanently cut off from the only extended family he had ever known. "I'll do whatever they want," he continued, his voice gaining urgency. "I'll transfer schools, change majors, work more hours, be more responsible. Whatever it takes." Before I could stop him, Tyler had sent the message. Within seconds, my phone was ringing with a call from Patricia. "Don't answer it," I said quickly, but Tyler was already reaching for the phone. "It's Grandma," he said with relief. "She wants to talk to me." I watched in horror as Tyler answered the call, his face immediately brightening with hope as he heard Patricia's voice on the other end. "Yes, I got your message," he said eagerly. "I want to come back. I want to make things right." I could only hear Tyler's side of the conversation, but I could see his expression changing as Patricia spoke. The hope in his eyes was gradually being replaced by confusion and then by devastation. "A trade school," Tyler repeated quietly. "But I thought—" He listened in silence for several minutes, his face growing paler with each passing second. "Yes, ma'am," he said finally. "I understand." Tyler ended the call and sat motionless in the passenger seat, staring down at his phone with an expression I had never seen before. "What did she say?" I asked gently. Tyler was quiet for a long moment before answering. "She said they've been researching alternatives to my current path, and they think I should consider a trade school program, something practical that doesn't require the academic rigor of college." The suggestion that Tyler, who had graduated valedictorian and maintained perfect grades while working 3 jobs, was not capable of academic rigor was so insulting that I struggled to find words. "She said they've already picked out several programs that might be good fits for someone with my limitations," Tyler continued in a hollow voice. "Automotive repair, plumbing, electrical work, things that don't require advanced mathematics or critical thinking skills." The systematic dismantling of Tyler's confidence was reaching new depths of cruelty. Patricia was not just asking him to lower his expectations, she was asking him to accept that he was intellectually inferior to his cousin and incapable of academic success. She also said they've calculated how much money the family has invested in my education over the years, Tyler added quietly. "Birthday gifts, Christmas presents, school supplies, graduation money. She said they'd like me to consider paying it back once I start earning money in a trade." I stared at Tyler in complete shock as the full scope of their manipulation became clear. They were not just asking him to abandon his dreams, they were demanding financial restitution for their previous investment in his education. "How much money?" I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. Tyler pulled out his phone and showed me a detailed spreadsheet that Patricia had apparently sent along with her demands. Every birthday present, every Christmas gift, every graduation card with money inside had been carefully cataloged and assigned a monetary value. The total was over $8,000. She said it's not about the money. Tyler explained, his voice growing smaller with each word. "It's about teaching me to take responsibility for the resources that have been wasted on my unrealistic goals." The idea that birthday presents and Christmas gifts were actually loans that could be called in at any moment was so deeply twisted that I could barely process it. My parents had retroactively transformed every gesture of love into a business transaction that Tyler was now expected to repay. "She wants me to sign an agreement acknowledging the debt and promising to pay it back within 2 years of completing trade school," Tyler continued. "She said it would teach me about accountability and help me understand the real cost of my poor decisions." I looked at my 18-year-old son, who was seriously considering signing a document that would saddle him with debt for the crime of accepting birthday presents from his grandparents, and I felt something cold and dangerous settling in my chest. They were not trying to teach Tyler responsibility. They were trying to control and humiliate him, to break his spirit so completely that he would never again have the confidence to pursue his dreams. "Tyler," I said quietly, "what do you want to do?" He looked up at me with eyes full of pain and confusion. "I want my family back, Mom. I want to belong somewhere." The simple honesty of his answer broke my heart completely because I understood exactly how he felt. I had spent my entire life trying to earn my parents' approval, and I had failed Tyler by not protecting him from the same impossible pursuit. "But I also want to be a doctor," he added in a whisper. "I know they think I'm not smart enough, but I really want to help people. I want to make a difference." In that moment, sitting in our driveway with snow falling gently around us, I realized that Tyler was being forced to choose between his family and his dreams. And the fact that this was even a choice showed me exactly how toxic my family had become. "You shouldn't have to choose," I said firmly. "Family should support your dreams, not demand that you abandon them." Tyler nodded sadly, but I could see that he was still tempted to return to that house and sign whatever document they put in front of him. The need for belonging was so strong that he was willing to sacrifice everything else to achieve it. And that was when I realized that protecting Tyler was going to require more than just removing him from tonight's situation. It was going to require me to take action against the people who had been systematically destroying him for 2 years. I sat in the driver's seat watching Tyler wrestle with an impossible decision, and I felt a clarity settle over me that I had never experienced before. For 37 years, I had been trying to navigate my family's expectations and manipulations, always hoping that if I just tried harder or loved more unconditionally, they would eventually accept and support the people I cared about most. But watching them systematically destroy my son had finally shown me who they really were. "Tyler," I said gently, "I need you to do something for me." He looked up from the phone where he had been staring at Patricia's spreadsheet of birthday presents turned into debt. "I need you to call your grandmother back and tell her we'll come back to discuss the trade school option." I continued, my voice steady despite the way my heart was hammering against my ribs. Tyler's face immediately brightened with hope and relief. "Really? You think we should go back?" "I think we need to hear exactly what they're proposing," I said carefully. "But I want you to do something while we're there. I want you to ask a lot of questions about their expectations and get them to explain their reasoning in detail." "Why?" Tyler asked, confusion evident in his voice. "Because I want to understand their position completely before we make any decisions," I replied, which was technically true, though not for the reasons Tyler assumed. Tyler was already dialing Patricia's number, his fingers moving quickly across the screen in his eagerness to repair the relationship with his grandparents. I listened to his side of the conversation, marveling at how quickly his tone shifted from defeated to hopeful. "Yes, we'd like to come back and discuss everything," he said eagerly. "Mom wants to understand all the options you're suggesting." I could hear Patricia's pleased voice through the phone, though I could not make out her specific words. Whatever she was saying was making Tyler's face light up with the first genuine smile I had seen from him all evening. "We'll be there in 15 minutes, Tyler concluded, ending the call and turning to me with excitement. She said they've prepared a whole presentation about career alternatives and that they want to help me find a more realistic path to success. The idea that my parents had prepared a presentation about why Tyler should abandon his dreams was both impressive in its thoroughness and horrifying in its cruelty. But I nodded and smiled as if this were wonderful news. "That sounds very thoughtful of them," I said, starting the car and backing out of our driveway. As we drove back through the snowy streets toward my childhood home, I found myself thinking about all the times I had given my parents the benefit of the doubt, all the times I had made excuses for their criticism or rationalized their conditional love as somehow being in my best interest. I thought about Tyler at age 10 crying because Grandpa Harold had told him he was too sensitive for baseball and should find a sport for weaker children. I had convinced myself that Harold was just trying to toughen Tyler up, that his criticism came from love and concern. I thought about Tyler at age 13, devastated because Grandma Patricia had compared his school project unfavorably to Brad's and suggested he try something more appropriate for his skill level. I had told myself that Patricia was just encouraging healthy competition between the cousins. I thought about Tyler at age 16, confused and hurt because his grandparents had missed his academic awards ceremony, but had driven 3 hours to attend Brad's baseball tournament that same weekend. I had made excuses about scheduling conflicts and prior commitments. For years, I had been enabling their emotional abuse by refusing to see it for what it was. I had taught Tyler to accept their criticism and doubt himself rather than recognizing that their treatment of him was completely unacceptable. But tonight was going to be different. Tonight, I was going to document every cruel word and manipulative suggestion. I was going to get them to explain their reasoning and reveal the full scope of their campaign against Tyler. And then I was going to use that information to protect my son from ever being hurt by them again. "Mom, are you okay?" Tyler asked, noticing my expression. "You look kind of intense." "I'm just thinking about everything that's happened tonight," I replied honestly. "I want to make sure we handle this situation correctly." Tyler nodded, apparently satisfied with my answer. He spent the rest of the drive staring out at the Christmas decorations on the houses we passed, his mood lifting with each block as he convinced himself that reconciliation was possible. When we pulled back into my parents' driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. Warm light still glowed from the windows, and the expensive Christmas decorations still proclaimed the family's success and respectability to the neighborhood. But I was seeing it all differently now. Tyler practically bounced up the front steps, his earlier devastation replaced by desperate optimism. He rang the doorbell with the enthusiasm of someone who believed he was about to be welcomed back into the fold. Harold opened the door with a satisfied smile, as if Tyler's return proved some important point about discipline and consequences. "I'm glad you came to your senses," he said, stepping aside to let us enter. "Sometimes young people need time to think before they can appreciate good advice." Patricia appeared from the living room, her face glowing with the particular satisfaction that came from having her authority acknowledged and respected. "Tyler, sweetheart, we're so proud of you for being mature enough to reconsider your options," she said warmly, embracing him with the kind of affection that had been completely absent during our earlier visit. I watched my son melt into his grandmother's arms, soaking up the approval he had been craving all evening. The speed with which they could switch from cruelty to warmth was both impressive and deeply disturbing. "We've set up a presentation in the dining room," Mark announced, appearing from the kitchen with Jennifer close behind. "We think you'll find the information very helpful." The dining room had been transformed since our earlier visit. The table had been cleared of dinner dishes and was now covered with brochures, printouts, and what appeared to be a carefully prepared portfolio of information. "Please sit down," Patricia said, gesturing toward the chairs that had been arranged to face a laptop computer connected to a large monitor. Tyler took a seat with visible excitement, ready to absorb whatever wisdom his family was prepared to share. I sat beside him, pulling out my phone and setting it on the table as if I planned to take notes. In reality, I was activating the voice recording app that I had downloaded months earlier for work meetings. "Before we begin," I said pleasantly. Would it be okay if I record this presentation? I want to make sure Tyler and I remember all the important details when we discuss this at home. Harold looked pleased by the request, as if my desire to document their guidance was evidence of my newfound respect for their judgment. Of course, he said graciously. We want you to have all the information you need to make the best decision for Tyler's future. Patricia nodded in agreement. We've put a lot of thought into these recommendations, and we want Tyler to be able to review them carefully. I pressed the record button and placed the phone in the center of the table, smiling as if I were simply being thorough rather than gathering evidence. Wonderful, I said. Please proceed with your presentation. Harold cleared his throat and assumed the authoritative posture he used for important business meetings. Tyler, your grandmother, and I have spent considerable time researching career alternatives that might be more appropriate for someone with your academic profile. Academic profile. Tyler asked, his voice eager and innocent. Well, son, Harold continued, we have to be realistic about your capabilities and limitations. Not everyone is cut out for the rigorous demands of medical school, and there's no shame in recognizing that fact early in the process. I watched Tyler's face carefully as Harold spoke, seeing the way my son absorbed the criticism without question or protest. Tyler had been so thoroughly conditioned to accept his grandparents' judgment that he was nodding along with their assessment of his inadequacy. Could you be more specific about what you see as Tyler's limitations? I asked pleasantly, as if I were genuinely curious rather than building a case. Patricia consulted her notes before responding. Well, Tyler's choice of community college over more prestigious options suggests a lack of confidence in his academic abilities. Students who are truly prepared for advanced study don't typically choose the easier path. But earlier, Tyler explained that he chose community college for financial reasons. I pointed out gently. Harold waved dismissively. Financial concerns are often used as an excuse by students who aren't confident they can succeed in more competitive environments. It's a form of self-protection. I kept my expression neutral as I listened to them twist Tyler's practical wisdom into evidence of academic cowardice. We've also observed that Tyler tends to overestimate his abilities. Patricia continued consulting her prepared notes. His belief that he can become a doctor despite his community college choice suggests unrealistic self-assessment. What about his grades and test scores? I asked. Don't those suggest he has the ability for advanced study? Jennifer leaned forward with the kind of smile adults use when explaining obvious truths to children. Grades and test scores can be misleading, Katie. They don't always reflect real understanding or the ability to perform under pressure. Could you explain what you mean by that? I asked, keeping my voice curious rather than confrontational. Mark shifted in his chair, looking slightly uncomfortable as he prepared to elaborate on their assessment of Tyler's intellectual capacity. What we're saying is that Tyler might be what educators call a good test taker, without having the deep critical thinking skills required for medical practice, he explained. He can memorize information and perform well on standardized assessments, but that doesn't necessarily translate to real-world problem-solving ability. I glanced at Tyler, who was listening to this assessment of his capabilities with a mixture of confusion and growing distress. His perfect grades and outstanding test scores were being dismissed as evidence that he was good at following directions rather than thinking independently. So you believe Tyler's academic achievements are not indicative of his actual intelligence? I asked, making sure the recording device was capturing every word. We believe Tyler is intelligent, Patricia said carefully, but intelligence comes in many forms. Not everyone has the specific type of analytical intelligence required for medical practice. Harold nodded in agreement. We think Tyler would be much happier and more successful in a field that matches his natural abilities rather than his unrealistic aspirations. The presentation continued for another 30 minutes with my family systematically dismantling Tyler's confidence while presenting their destruction as loving guidance. They explained in detail why they believed he was intellectually inadequate for medicine, why his financial concerns were actually character flaws, and why accepting a trade school education would be the mature and responsible choice. Through it all, Tyler listened with the heartbreaking eagerness of someone desperate to please, absorbing every criticism and accepting every judgment without protest. And through it all, my phone continued recording every word. When they finally finished their presentation and asked Tyler what he thought about their recommendations, I had everything I needed to understand exactly who my family was and what they had been doing to my son. "This is very helpful information," I said pleasantly, reaching for my phone. "Tyler and I will definitely need to discuss all of this carefully before making any decisions." But I was not planning to discuss anything with Tyler. I was planning to destroy the people who had spent 2 years destroying him. The silence in the car was different this time as we pulled out of my parents' driveway for the second time that evening. Tyler sat slumped in the passenger seat, no longer clutching his photo album, but instead holding a manila folder full of trade school brochures and community college transfer information. The weight of his family's expectations seemed to be crushing him into the upholstery. "They really put a lot of thought into this," he said quietly, his voice devoid of the excitement he had shown earlier. "All those brochures and research about different career paths." I glanced at him as I navigated the snowy streets, seeing how completely deflated he looked after 90 minutes of having his dreams systematically dismantled by people who claimed to love him. "What did you think about their presentation?" I asked, carefully wanting to understand his perspective before sharing my own. Tyler was quiet for several blocks, staring out at the Christmas lights that seemed to mock the darkness of our situation. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I think they might be right about me not being smart enough for medical school," he admitted. "I mean, they know more about these things than I do, and if they think I should consider other options—" The resignation in his voice broke my heart completely. Tyler had entered that house with dreams and determination, and he was leaving with the belief that his family's assessment of his limitations was more accurate than his own understanding of his capabilities. "Tyler," I said gently, "do you remember what your biology professor said about your performance in his class?" "He said I was one of the best students he'd ever taught," Tyler replied automatically, "but maybe he was just being nice." "And what about your chemistry professor?" "She offered to write me a recommendation letter for medical school and said I had exceptional analytical skills." Tyler said, then immediately added, "But maybe she doesn't know what real medical students are like." I felt anger building in my chest as I realized how thoroughly my family had convinced Tyler to doubt every piece of positive feedback he had ever received. They had not just criticized his choices, they had taught him to distrust any evidence that contradicted their narrative of his inadequacy. "What about the research you did on medical school admissions?" I asked. "What did you learn about community college students who successfully applied to medical programs?" Tyler shifted in his seat, pulling his jacket tighter around himself. "I found lots of examples of students who took their prerequisites at community college and got into good medical schools, but maybe those were exceptional cases." "Exceptional how? Maybe they were naturally brilliant or had connections or something," Tyler said sadly. "Maybe I was just looking for information that would support what I wanted to believe instead of facing reality." The systematic destruction of Tyler's confidence was so complete that he was now questioning his own research abilities and critical thinking skills. My family had not just attacked his dreams, they had convinced him that his capacity for rational analysis was fundamentally flawed. "Tyler, I want you to tell me something," I said, pulling over into a well-lit parking lot so I could look at him directly. "In your own words, without thinking about what anyone else has said, why do you want to be a doctor?" Tyler looked surprised by the question, as if no one had asked him to articulate his own motivations in a very long time. "I want to help people who are suffering," he said slowly. "I want to use science and medicine to solve problems and improve lives. I want to be the kind of person patients can trust when they're scared and vulnerable." The passion in his voice when he talked about his actual motivations was completely different from the defeated tone he had been using all evening. "And when you imagine yourself in 10 years, what do you see?" I continued. Tyler closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, there was a spark there that had been missing for hours. "I see myself in a white coat talking to patients about their treatment options," he said quietly. "I see myself staying late to research unusual cases or working with a team to develop new treatment protocols. I see myself making a real difference in people's lives." "Does that vision feel realistic to you?" I asked. "It used to," Tyler admitted. "But after tonight, I'm not sure if that was just wishful thinking." I reached over and took his hand, waiting until he looked at me before speaking. "Tyler, I need to tell you something that I should have told you years ago," I began. "Your grandparents have been wrong about you since you were a child, and I have been wrong to let you think their opinion mattered more than your own achievements and dreams." Tyler looked confused, as if the possibility that his grandparents could be systematically wrong about something important had never occurred to him. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I mean that nothing they said tonight was based on evidence or reality," I said firmly. "They have been invested in a narrative about your inadequacy for so long that they cannot see who you actually are." I pulled out my phone and showed Tyler the recording I had made during their presentation. "I recorded everything they said tonight," I explained, "and I want you to listen to it with me tomorrow when you've had some sleep and some distance from their manipulation." Tyler stared at the phone as if it contained something dangerous. "Why did you record it?" "Because I wanted documentation of exactly what they said and how they said it," I replied honestly, "and because I suspected that their arguments would not hold up to scrutiny once we examined them carefully." We sat in the parking lot for several more minutes while Tyler processed this information. I could see him struggling with the possibility that his grandparents' assessment of his capabilities might not be the objective truth he had always assumed it to be. "Mom," he said, finally, his voice hesitant, "can I tell you something that I've never told anyone before?" "Of course." Tyler took a deep breath as if preparing to confess something shameful. "Grandpa Harold has been meeting with me privately for the past 2 years. He's been coming to my school sometimes during lunch or asking me to meet him at the coffee shop near campus." A chill ran down my spine as I realized that Harold's manipulation of Tyler had been even more extensive than I had imagined. "What did you talk about during these meetings?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "He said he was concerned about my future and wanted to help me understand what it would take to be successful," Tyler explained. "He told me that my grades and test scores were good, but that I needed to be realistic about my limitations." The idea that Harold had been secretly meeting with Tyler to undermine his confidence while pretending to offer guidance was so manipulative that I felt physically sick. "He also said that you were struggling financially because of my college plans." Tyler continued, his voice growing smaller. "He said that a good son would choose a career path that wouldn't be such a burden on his mother." I felt my hands clench into fists as I understood how Harold had weaponized my love for Tyler against his own dreams. He had convinced my son that pursuing his goals was somehow selfish and harmful to me. "What else did he tell you?" I asked, though I was dreading the answer. "He said that single mothers often have unrealistic expectations for their children because they want to prove that they can raise successful kids without fathers," Tyler admitted. "He said, you might be encouraging my medical school plans because you needed to believe I could achieve more than I actually could." The psychological manipulation was so sophisticated and cruel that I could barely process it. Harold had not only attacked Tyler's confidence, but had convinced him that my support was actually a form of maternal delusion that he needed to protect me from. He also said that if I really loved you, I would convince you to start dating again, Tyler added quietly. "He said you needed to find a successful man who could provide better guidance for both of us." The suggestion that Tyler should manipulate me into remarrying for the family's benefit was so deeply inappropriate that I struggled to find words to respond. "Tyler?" I said carefully. How did these conversations make you feel? He was quiet for a long moment before answering. Confused and scared, he admitted, because everything Grandpa Harold said made sense logically, but it also made me feel hopeless about my future. Did you ever tell me about these meetings? Tyler shook his head sadly. Grandpa Harold said they should be our secret because you were already under so much stress. He said that telling you about our conversations would just add to your worries unnecessarily. The isolation and secrecy were classic manipulation tactics designed to prevent Tyler from getting outside perspective on the psychological abuse he was experiencing. For the past 2 years, I've been trying to figure out how to be the son that Grandpa Harold thinks I should be, Tyler continued. I've been trying to lower my expectations and be more realistic about my capabilities, but no matter how hard I tried, I could never seem to meet his standards. I realized that Tyler had been carrying the weight of Harold's impossible expectations and systematic undermining for 2 years without any support or validation from outside sources. He had been trying to solve an unsolvable puzzle while being told that his inability to solve it proved his inadequacy. Tyler, I need you to understand something very important, I said, taking his face in my hands so he had to look directly at me. Everything your grandfather told you was designed to control and manipulate you. None of it was true. But he seemed so sure, Tyler protested weakly. Manipulative people always seem sure, I replied firmly. That's part of how they convince their victims to doubt themselves instead of questioning the manipulation. Tyler stared at me with wide eyes as if I had just suggested that gravity might not be real. You're saying that Grandpa Harold was deliberately trying to hurt me? He asked, his voice filled with disbelief. I'm saying that Grandpa Harold was trying to control you by destroying your confidence and independence, I corrected. Whether he understood how harmful that was or not, the effect on you has been devastating. We sat in the parking lot for another 20 minutes while Tyler slowly began to process the possibility that his grandparents' treatment of him had been abusive rather than loving. It was like watching someone wake up from a 2-year nightmare and realize that the monsters had been real all along. What do we do now? Tyler asked finally, his voice small and uncertain. I looked at my 18-year-old son, who was brilliant and hardworking and kind, and who had been systematically convinced that he was inadequate and delusional. I thought about Harold's secret meetings and Patricia's public humiliation and Mark's complicit silence. And I realized that protecting Tyler was going to require more than just removing him from their influence. It was going to require me to expose exactly who they were and what they had been doing. Now, I said firmly, we make sure this never happens to anyone else. When we finally arrived home, Tyler went straight to his room with the folder of trade school brochures, claiming he wanted to review his options before making any decisions. I knew he was actually trying to process everything that had happened, but I was grateful for the space to think clearly about what I needed to do next. I made myself a cup of coffee and settled at my laptop in the kitchen, staring at the blank screen while my mind raced through everything I had learned that evening. The recording on my phone contained nearly 2 hours of my family systematically destroying Tyler's confidence, but I suspected that was only the tip of the iceberg. If Harold and Patricia had been this calculating about undermining Tyler's education and self-worth, there had to be other evidence of their manipulation that I could uncover. I started with the most obvious search, my father's construction company. Harold had always presented his business as highly successful, using it as evidence of his superior judgment and work ethic. But something about Mark's earlier discomfort when discussing family finances made me suspect that the reality might be different from the image. A quick search of public business records revealed that Brennan Construction LLC had been facing significant challenges for the past 18 months. There were 3 outstanding lawsuits from subcontractors claiming unpaid wages, and the company's credit rating had been steadily declining since the previous year. I dug deeper, searching through court filings and business registration documents, and discovered that Harold's company owed over $200,000 to various suppliers and contractors. Several liens had been filed against company assets, and there were 2 pending foreclosure actions on properties that Harold had used as collateral for business loans. The man who had spent the evening lecturing Tyler about responsibility and accountability was apparently unable to manage his own financial obligations. But the most interesting discovery came when I searched for recent news articles about the construction industry in our area. A local business journal had published an article 3 months earlier about the impact of rising material costs on small construction companies, and Harold's business had been specifically mentioned as an example of companies struggling to adapt to changing market conditions. The article quoted Harold extensively, and his comments revealed a pattern of blaming external factors for his company's problems rather than taking responsibility for poor management decisions. He complained about unfair competition from larger companies, unreasonable demands from clients, and the challenges of finding reliable workers in the current economy. It was exactly the kind of excuse-making that he had criticized Tyler for engaging in when my son explained his practical reasons for choosing community college. I continued searching and found Harold's LinkedIn profile, which painted a very different picture of his business success than the reality revealed by public records. According to his professional profile, Brennan Construction was expanding rapidly and leading the market in innovative building solutions. The disconnect between Harold's public image and his actual circumstances was startling, and it explained a lot about his treatment of Tyler. Harold had been projecting his own professional failures onto my son, using Tyler as a scapegoat for his inability to maintain the successful image he had cultivated. Next, I turned my attention to Patricia's social media presence, which I had always avoided because her posts tended to be either boring or judgmental. But tonight, I was looking for evidence of how she had been portraying Tyler to her extended social network. What I found was even worse than I had expected. Patricia's Facebook page was filled with posts about the challenges of modern parenting and the importance of maintaining family standards. She frequently shared articles about entitled teenagers and the need for tough love in raising responsible adults. But more disturbing were the specific posts that seemed to be about Tyler without mentioning him by name. 3 months earlier, she had shared an article about community college students with the comment, "Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for our children is help them understand their limitations rather than encouraging unrealistic dreams." 2 months earlier, she had posted a quote about the importance of family loyalty with the comment, "It breaks my heart when young people choose paths that embarrass their families instead of honoring the sacrifices their elders have made." And just last month, she had shared a prayer request asking for wisdom and guidance for a family member who has lost his way and needs help finding a more appropriate path for his life. The pattern was clear and deliberate. Patricia had been using social media to publicly shame Tyler while maintaining plausible deniability about who she was targeting. Anyone who knew our family situation would understand exactly who she was talking about, but she could always claim she was speaking generally about modern parenting challenges. I screenshotted every relevant post and comment, building a comprehensive record of how Patricia had been systematically undermining Tyler's reputation within their social circle. Then I searched for information about Brad's academic performance at Yale, curious about whether the golden child was actually as successful as my family claimed. What I found was surprising, but not shocking. Brad's social media presence revealed a young man who was struggling academically and socially at an elite university. His posts were filled with complaints about difficult classes, demanding professors, and the stress of trying to keep up with more academically prepared classmates. More telling were the photos from his dorm room and campus activities. Brad was clearly spending more time partying than studying, and several of his posts referenced academic probation and the need to get serious about his grades. A deeper search revealed that Brad had been placed on academic warning twice during his first year at Yale, and his continued enrollment was contingent on significant improvement in his academic performance. The family's golden child was actually failing at the prestigious university they had held up as the standard Tyler should aspire to meet. I continued researching, following every lead and connection I could think of. I searched for information about the high school guidance counselor, who had supposedly been influenced by my parents' interference. I looked up the admissions counselors at the universities where Tyler's opportunities had been mysteriously withdrawn. And slowly, a picture began to emerge of a systematic campaign to control Tyler's future that went far beyond what Mark had revealed to me earlier that evening. Harold and Patricia had not just made phone calls to undermine Tyler's opportunities. They had orchestrated a comprehensive effort to ensure that his only remaining option was the community college path they could then use as evidence of his inadequacy. They had poisoned his relationships with guidance counselors, sabotaged his scholarship opportunities, and spread rumors about his character and abilities throughout their social network. They had isolated him from potential advocates and convinced him that his family's assessment of his limitations was more accurate than his own achievements and capabilities. The scope of their manipulation was breathtaking in its thoroughness and chilling in its calculated cruelty. But as devastating as these discoveries were, they also gave me something I had never had before: clarity about who my parents actually were and what they were capable of. For years, I had made excuses for their behavior and convinced myself that their criticism came from love and concern. I had taught Tyler to absorb their judgment and doubt himself rather than recognizing that their treatment of him was systematically abusive. But now I had evidence. Documentation, proof of their lies and manipulation that could not be explained away or rationalized as loving guidance. And most importantly, I had a recording of them explicitly stating their beliefs about Tyler's intellectual limitations and their plans for controlling his future. I spent the rest of the night organizing the evidence I had gathered, creating a comprehensive file that documented every aspect of my family's campaign against Tyler. Screenshots of social media posts, copies of business records, transcripts of recorded conversations, and a detailed timeline of their interference with his educational opportunities. When the sun began to rise on Christmas morning, I had everything I needed to protect Tyler from ever being manipulated by them again. But protection was no longer enough. I wanted justice. I wanted consequences. I wanted my family to face the same kind of public humiliation and professional damage they had inflicted on my son. And I was beginning to formulate a plan that would give me exactly that. Tyler emerged from his room around 10 in the morning, looking exhausted but more clear-eyed than he had the night before. He found me still sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by printed documents and open laptops. "Mom, what are you doing?" he asked, pouring himself a cup of coffee and settling into the chair across from me. "Research," I replied simply. "I've been learning some very interesting things about your grandparents and their business dealings." Tyler looked at the scattered papers with growing concern. "What kind of research?" I turned my laptop screen toward him, showing him Harold's business debt and Patricia's social media campaign. "The kind that proves everything they told you about success and responsibility was complete hypocrisy," I said firmly. Tyler stared at the evidence in stunned silence, his coffee growing cold as he processed the scope of his grandparents' deception. "What does this mean?" he asked finally. I looked at my son, who was brilliant and hard-working and deserved so much better than the family that had spent 2 years trying to destroy his dreams. "It means," I said quietly, "that we're going to make sure everyone knows exactly who they really are." Over the next 3 days, I threw myself into planning with the kind of methodical precision that my parents would have appreciated if it had been directed towards something they approved of. Tyler spent most of his time sleeping and slowly processing the evidence I had gathered occasionally, asking questions about what I had discovered, but mostly just trying to understand how extensively he had been manipulated. "I keep thinking about all the times I doubted myself," he told me on December 27th as we sat in our living room surrounded by files and printouts. "Every time I second-guessed my abilities or wondered if I was being unrealistic about medical school, they planted those doubts deliberately. I watched my son grapple with the realization that his own family had been systematically undermining his confidence for years, and I felt my resolve strengthen with each moment of his pain. The worst part is that I was starting to believe them. Tyler continued, his voice quiet but steady. If we hadn't left when we did, I think I would have signed that agreement and enrolled in trade school just to make them happy. The idea that Tyler had come so close to abandoning his dreams for their approval made my chest tight with rage. But it also clarified exactly what I needed to do to prevent them from ever having that kind of power over him again. I'd been researching my family's social and professional networks, mapping out the relationships and reputations they had spent decades building. Harold's construction business depended heavily on referrals from the country club and church communities, where he and Patricia were prominent members. Patricia's sense of identity was deeply tied to her standing in various social organizations and volunteer groups. They had weaponized their social connections against Tyler, spreading rumors and undermining his opportunities through their network of relationships. Now I was going to use those same networks against them. The annual New Year's Eve party at the country club was just 4 days away, and it would be the perfect opportunity to execute my plan. Every important person in my parents' social and professional circle would be there, including many of the people who had been fed lies about Tyler over the past 2 years. But first, I needed to gather additional evidence and build strategic alliances with family members who might be willing to support the truth once they understood what had really been happening. I started with Tyler's high school guidance counselor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had always been one of his strongest advocates. I called her on December 28th and explained that I was trying to understand why Tyler's college opportunities had suddenly disappeared the previous spring. "I've been wondering about that myself," Mrs. Rodriguez admitted when I asked about any unusual contacts from family members. "Your parents called me several times last year with concerns about Tyler's college plans." "What kind of concerns?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "They said they were worried that I was encouraging him to aim too high academically," she explained. "They suggested that Tyler might have learning disabilities that hadn't been properly diagnosed and that his grades might not reflect his true capabilities." The systematic nature of their manipulation was becoming even clearer. They had not just undermined Tyler directly, they had convinced his advocates that supporting his dreams was actually harmful to him. They also suggested that Tyler might be misrepresenting his volunteer work and extracurricular activities. Mrs. Rodriguez continued, "They asked me to verify his claims about tutoring other students and working at the animal shelter." I felt my anger building as I realized that Harold and Patricia had tried to paint Tyler as a liar and fraud to the one person at school who'd been consistently supporting his goals. "What was your impression of Tyler's honesty about his activities?" I asked. "Tyler was one of the most honest and hardworking students I've ever worked with," Mrs. Rodriguez replied immediately. "His volunteer work was well documented, and several teachers specifically mentioned how helpful he was as a tutor. I found your parents' concerns very strange." "Strange how?" "They seem more interested in discouraging Tyler than in getting help for any real problems," she explained. "When I suggested having Tyler evaluated by the school psychologist to rule out learning disabilities, they declined. When I offered to connect them with resources for students with special needs, they said that wouldn't be necessary." The picture was becoming crystal clear. Harold and Patricia had not been genuinely concerned about Tyler's well-being. They had been trying to manipulate his support system into limiting his opportunities. "Mrs. Rodriguez, would you be willing to document your interactions with my parents?" I asked. "I'm gathering information about some family issues, and your perspective would be very valuable." "Of course," she replied immediately. "Tyler deserved much better support than what he received, and I'd be happy to help in any way I can." Next, I contacted the admissions counselors at State University and Regional University to understand exactly what had happened with Tyler's scholarship offers. Getting information from university officials was more challenging, but I eventually reached someone willing to discuss the irregularities that had led to Tyler's opportunities being withdrawn. We received several calls from family members expressing concerns about the student's character and academic integrity. The admissions counselor explained carefully. While we don't typically adjust offers based on third-party reports, the specific nature of the allegations required us to conduct additional review. "What kind of allegations?" I asked, though my stomach was already churning. Claims that the student had misrepresented his volunteer work, that his grades were the result of grade inflation rather than real achievement, and that his family had concerns about his emotional stability and decision-making abilities. The cruelty of using Tyler's emotional well-being against him was breathtaking, especially since any emotional struggles he might have had were directly caused by their systematic abuse. When we tried to follow up with the student's guidance counselor and teachers for verification, the counselor continued, "We encountered some conflicting information that made us concerned about the accuracy of the original application materials. I realized that Harold and Patricia had probably contacted Tyler's teachers after speaking with Mrs. Rodriguez, spreading their poison throughout his entire support network at school. Would it be possible to review Tyler's file and see if the original concerns were justified?" I asked. "Given what we know now, I suspect they were not," the counselor admitted. "If the student is interested in reapplying, I would encourage him to do so. His original credentials were actually quite impressive." By December 29th, I had gathered testimonies from 6 different people who had been contacted by my parents with concerns about Tyler. Teachers, counselors, university officials, and even the supervisor at the animal shelter where Tyler volunteered had all received calls questioning his character abilities or honesty. The pattern was consistent and damning. Harold and Patricia had conducted a systematic campaign to destroy Tyler's opportunities while maintaining plausible deniability about their motivations. But I still needed allies within the family itself. People who could corroborate Tyler's experiences and validate the evidence I had gathered. I decided to start with my cousin Diana, Harold's niece, who had always seemed genuinely fond of Tyler and had often expressed pride in his academic achievements. Diana lived 3 hours away and rarely attended family gatherings, which meant she had been insulated from the worst of Harold and Patricia's manipulation. When I called her and explained what had been happening, her reaction was immediate and outraged. "Katie, I had no idea," she said, her voice filled with shock and anger. "I've been sending Tyler money for his birthday and Christmas every year, and I never heard anything back from him. Your mother told me he was too embarrassed about his college situation to accept gifts from family members." The revelation that my parents had been intercepting Diana's gifts to Tyler was like a punch to the stomach. "What do you mean, intercepting?" I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. "I've been sending checks to your parents' house every year with notes for Tyler," Diana explained. "Your mother always calls to thank me and says Tyler is grateful, but too ashamed to respond personally because of his academic struggles." I felt sick as I realized that Tyler had been deprived of not just financial support, but also the knowledge that extended family members cared about him and believed in his potential. "Diana, Tyler never received any of those gifts," I said quietly, "and he doesn't know that you've been trying to support him." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for several seconds before Diana spoke again, her voice tight with fury. "How much money are we talking about?" she asked. I asked her to estimate what she had sent over the past 3 years, and the total came to nearly $2,000. Combined with similar revelations from other relatives, I was beginning to understand that Harold and Patricia had been systematically stealing from Tyler while using his supposed ingratitude as evidence of his character flaws. "I need to see Tyler," Diana said firmly. "I need to apologize for not doing more to stay in touch and make sure he knows that not everyone in this family has lost their minds." "Would you be willing to attend the New Year's Eve party at the country club?" I asked. "I'm planning to address some of these family issues publicly, and your support would mean a lot." "I'll be there," Diana replied without hesitation. "And I'll bring copies of every check I sent and every conversation I had with your parents about Tyler." Over the next 2 days, I reached out to other extended family members and discovered that Harold and Patricia's manipulation had been even more extensive than I had imagined. Uncle James, my father's brother, had been told that Tyler was struggling with depression and substance abuse issues that made him unsuitable for family gatherings. Aunt Sharon had been informed that Tyler had been involved in some kind of academic dishonesty scandal that the family was trying to handle quietly. Each relative I spoke with had been fed different lies designed to isolate Tyler and justify his exclusion from family events. But each of them also expressed genuine shock and anger when they learned the truth about what had been happening. By December 31st, I had assembled a coalition of family members who were ready to confront Harold and Patricia about their systematic abuse of Tyler. I had documentation of their lies, evidence of their financial theft, and recordings of their own words condemning Tyler for limitations he did not actually possess. Most importantly, I had a plan that would expose their cruelty and manipulation to the entire social network they had spent decades cultivating. The New Year's Eve party would bring together over 200 people from the community, including business associates, church members, country club friends, and extended family. It was the perfect venue for Harold and Patricia to experience the same kind of public humiliation they had inflicted on Tyler. "Are you sure about this, Mom?" Tyler asked on the morning of December 31st as I made final preparations for the evening's confrontation. "It feels like we're sinking to their level." I looked at my son, who was still so kind and forgiving, despite everything he had endured, and felt a moment of doubt about the scope of what I was planning. But then I thought about the 2 years of systematic abuse, the intercepted gifts, the sabotaged opportunities, and the deliberate campaign to destroy his confidence and future. "Tyler," I said gently, "sometimes protecting the people we love requires us to stop being nice to the people who are hurting them." He nodded slowly, understanding that this was about more than just our family dynamics. "Besides," I added with a smile that probably looked more predatory than reassuring, "I'm not sinking to their level. I'm rising to the occasion." Tonight, Harold and Patricia were going to learn that their grandson had inherited more than just his mother's protective instincts. He had also inherited her capacity for strategic thinking and long-term planning. And they were about to discover exactly what happened when someone systematically underestimated both of us. The morning of New Year's Eve dawned clear and cold with the kind of crisp winter light that made everything look sharp and precise. I woke up feeling more focused and determined than I had in years, as if all the doubt and confusion that had plagued our family relationships had finally crystallized into perfect clarity. Tyler was already awake when I came downstairs, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open and several folders of evidence spread around him. He looked up when he heard me enter, and I saw something in his eyes that I had not seen since before Christmas Eve confidence. "I've been reading through everything you gathered," he said, gesturing at the documents. "I want to understand exactly what they did and how they did it." I poured myself coffee and sat across from him, watching as he methodically reviewed the evidence of his grandparents' systematic manipulation. "The thing that gets me the most is how calculated it all was." He continued, holding up a printed email exchange between Harold and one of Tyler's teachers. "They didn't just disapprove of my choices, they actively worked to eliminate my options so that disapproval would be the only rational response." The maturity and analytical clarity in Tyler's voice reminded me forcefully of why Harold and Patricia's assessment of his intellectual limitations was so absurd. My son was processing a complex pattern of psychological manipulation with the same methodical precision he brought to his science coursework. "Are you having any second thoughts about tonight?" I asked, wanting to make sure he was fully on board with what we were planning. Tyler was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "Part of me feels guilty about exposing them publicly," he admitted. "They're still my grandparents, and some of their friends have been nice to me over the years." I nodded, understanding his conflict. Tyler's capacity for empathy and forgiveness was one of his greatest strengths, but it was also what had made him vulnerable to his grandparents' manipulation. "But then I think about other kids who might be going through something similar," he continued. What if Brad has a younger sibling someday who doesn't meet their standards? What if one of their friends has a grandchild who chooses a path they disapprove of? The realization that Tyler was thinking beyond his own situation to consider how our confrontation might protect other vulnerable young people made me incredibly proud. "I think we need to do this," he concluded firmly, "not just for us, but for anyone else who might become their target in the future." Around noon, Diana arrived with her husband Robert, both of them carrying boxes of documentation related to their attempts to support Tyler over the years. Diana had driven 3 hours to be part of our confrontation, and her presence felt like a validation of everything we were trying to achieve. I brought copies of every check I sent, every birthday card, every Christmas note, Diana announced, setting her boxes on the kitchen table. I also brought bank records showing when the checks were cashed, which might be useful if your parents try to claim they were returned or never received. Robert, who worked as a forensic accountant, had spent the morning reviewing the financial evidence and organizing it into a comprehensive timeline. "What your parents did constitutes theft by deception," he told me bluntly. "They accepted money intended for Tyler under false pretenses and used it for their own purposes while claiming Tyler was too ashamed to accept family support." The clinical assessment of my parents' behavior as criminal rather than merely inappropriate was somehow both shocking and reassuring. The pattern of intercepted gifts and forged responses also suggests mail fraud. Robert continued consulting his notes. If they were signing Tyler's name to thank you cards or declining gifts on his behalf, that's a federal crime. I had not been thinking in terms of criminal charges, but Robert's analysis made it clear that Harold and Patricia's manipulation had crossed legal boundaries as well as ethical ones. Uncle James arrived in the early afternoon with his wife Carol, both of them visibly angry about the lies they had been told regarding Tyler's supposed substance abuse issues. "I've been worried sick about that boy for months," James said, embracing Tyler with obvious relief. "Your grandmother told me you were struggling with alcohol and that the family was trying to get you into treatment without making it public." Tyler looked stunned by this revelation. "Uncle James, I've never even tried alcohol. I'm too busy with work and school to party." "That's exactly what I would expect from you," James replied firmly, "which is why I should have questioned the story instead of just accepting it. I'm sorry I didn't reach out to check on you directly." Carol produced her phone and showed us a series of text messages from Patricia over the past 6 months, each one providing updates on Tyler's supposed recovery progress and asking for prayers for a young man who was fighting his demons. "She made it sound like you were in and out of rehab," Carol explained, her voice tight with anger. "She said the family was trying to support you through a difficult time while maintaining your privacy." The systematic nature of Patricia's lies was becoming even more clear. She'd not just told one story to discredit Tyler. She had crafted different narratives for different audiences, each one designed to justify his exclusion, while positioning herself as a concerned grandmother. Aunt Sharon arrived next, bringing with her a folder full of printed conversations from my parents' church prayer group. Patricia had been using their weekly prayer requests to spread rumors about Tyler's supposed academic dishonesty and emotional instability. "I saved these because I thought they might be useful for organizing additional prayer support," Sharon explained, looking embarrassed. "But now I realize Patricia was manipulating our entire prayer circle to turn us against Tyler." The evidence was overwhelming in its scope and detail. Harold and Patricia had conducted a comprehensive campaign to destroy Tyler's reputation across every social network they shared, using different lies and manipulations for each audience. By late afternoon, we had assembled a coalition of 8 family members who were ready to confront Harold and Patricia about their systematic abuse. Diana had also contacted several of her friends who knew Tyler and asked them to attend the party as additional witnesses to his actual character and achievements. "I want to make sure they can't dismiss tonight as just a family disagreement," Diana explained. "When independent observers confirm that Tyler is nothing like the troubled young man Patricia has been describing, it will be much harder for them to maintain their narrative." As evening approached, I felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation that reminded me of the moments before a final exam or job interview. Everything we had worked toward for the past week was about to be put to the test. Tyler emerged from his room wearing a navy blue suit that made him look mature and professional every inch, the successful young man he actually was, rather than the failure his grandparents had tried to make him believe he was. "How do I look?" he asked, adjusting his tie with slightly shaking hands. "You look like someone who belongs at medical school." I replied honestly, and I saw his shoulders straighten with pride and determination. Diana, Robert, James, Carol, and Sharon were all dressed for the formal occasion, creating an impressive group of allies who would be standing with us when we confronted Harold and Patricia. "Are we ready for this?" James asked as we gathered in our living room for a final strategy session. I looked around at these family members who had been deceived and manipulated just as thoroughly as Tyler, but who had chosen truth and justice over comfortable denial once they understood what had really been happening. "We're ready," I said firmly. "Tonight, Harold and Patricia are going to face the consequences of 2 years of systematic cruelty." Tyler took my hand and squeezed it gently. "Thank you, Mom, for believing in me and for fighting for me." "Thank you for being worth fighting for," I replied, and I meant every word. As we prepared to leave for the country club, I felt a sense of clarity and purpose that I had never experienced before. For 37 years, I had been trying to earn my parents' approval and acceptance, always hoping that if I just tried harder or loved more unconditionally, they would eventually treat me and the people I loved with basic respect and kindness. But tonight was not about earning anything from them. Tonight was about showing them exactly what happened when they systematically underestimated the people they had tried to destroy. Harold and Patricia had spent 2 years teaching Tyler that his dreams were unrealistic and his abilities were inadequate. They had used their social networks to spread lies about his character and had stolen money intended to support his education. They had counted on our silence, our desire to maintain family peace, and our willingness to absorb their abuse rather than challenging their authority. They had made a serious miscalculation. And in a few hours, they were going to learn that Tyler had inherited more than just my protective instincts. He had also inherited my strategic thinking, my capacity for long-term planning, and my absolute refusal to let anyone hurt the people I love without facing serious consequences. Tonight, the people who had tried to make Tyler feel small and powerless were going to discover exactly how formidable he could be when he was properly supported and encouraged. And they were going to learn that lesson in front of every person whose opinion they had spent decades cultivating and protecting. The country club's ballroom was decorated with gold and silver streamers, elegant floral arrangements, and twinkling lights that created an atmosphere of celebration and prosperity. 200 of the community's most prominent citizens mingled with champagne glasses and confident smiles their formal attire and animated conversations, creating the perfect backdrop for the kind of social event my parents had always used to showcase their success and respectability. Harold stood near the bar holding court with several business associates, his booming voice carrying across the room as he discussed recent construction projects and upcoming development opportunities. Patricia moved gracefully through the crowd in her silver evening gown, greeting church friends and charity organization colleagues with the practiced charm she had perfected over decades of social climbing. They looked completely at ease in their element, surrounded by people who respected their opinions and valued their friendship. It was exactly the kind of setting where they felt most powerful and confident, which made it the perfect place to destroy them. Tyler and I entered the ballroom with our coalition of family allies, and I watched Harold's face change when he saw us approaching. His initial surprise quickly shifted to irritation as he realized we were not there to apologize or seek reconciliation. "Katie, Tyler," he said with forced pleasantness, clearly aware that his business associates were watching the interaction with interest. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight." "We wouldn't miss it," I replied with a smile that probably looked more predatory than friendly. "Tyler has something he'd like to share with the family. Patricia materialized beside Harold with the kind of social radar that had made her such an effective manipulator over the years. Her eyes swept over our group, taking in Diana's presence and the determined expressions on everyone's faces. "This is hardly the appropriate venue for family discussions," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough warmth to maintain appearances while communicating clear displeasure. "Actually, I think this is the perfect venue," Diana said firmly, stepping forward to stand beside Tyler. "Given how much you've been sharing about Tyler's situation with your social network." I saw Harold's jaw tighten as he realized that Diana knew about their campaign of lies and manipulation. His eyes darted around the room, calculating how to minimize the potential damage to his reputation. "Perhaps we should move this conversation to somewhere more private," he suggested, gesturing toward one of the smaller meeting rooms adjacent to the ballroom. "No," Tyler said clearly, his voice carrying enough to attract the attention of nearby guests. "I think our family friends should hear what I have to say." The confidence in Tyler's voice was unmistakable, and I saw several people turn to listen with curious interest. Mark and Jennifer appeared at the edge of the growing circle, their faces pale with apprehension as they realized this was not going to be a quiet family reconciliation. "Tyler has been working on a presentation," I announced to the expanding audience, "about academic achievement, family support, and the importance of truth in relationships." Harold's face had gone completely white as he understood that we were planning to expose his lies in front of the very people whose respect he had spent decades cultivating. "This is completely inappropriate," Patricia hissed, her social mask slipping slightly. "These people don't need to be involved in private family matters." "You made it their business when you used them to spread lies about Tyler's character and abilities," James said, firmly stepping forward to support his nephew. The circle of observers had grown to include nearly 30 people, many of whom I recognized as members of Harold's business network and Patricia's church community. Their faces showed a mixture of curiosity and concern as they sensed the tension building between family members. Tyler pulled out a folder of documents and cleared his throat, drawing the attention of everyone within hearing distance. 3 days ago, my grandparents excluded me from Christmas dinner because they said I was a failure who didn't deserve to be part of family celebrations. He began, his voice steady and clear. They told me that my choice to attend community college while working 3 jobs proved that I wasn't smart enough for our family's standards. Murmurs of surprise rippled through the crowd as people processed this information. I saw several faces turn toward Harold and Patricia with expressions of shock and disapproval. They presented me with a bill for over $8,000. Tyler continued, holding up Patricia's itemized spreadsheet. Every birthday present, Christmas gift, and graduation card was suddenly a loan that needed to be repaid because they considered their investment in my education to have been wasted. The gasps from the audience were audible now, and I saw Harold's business associates exchanging uncomfortable glances as they absorbed the implications of what Tyler was revealing. "But what I didn't know until this week," Tyler said, his voice gaining strength, "was that my grandparents had been systematically sabotaging my educational opportunities for 2 years while telling everyone in their social network that I was failing because of my own inadequacies." He opened his folder and began reading from the documentation we had gathered, his voice clear and emotionless, as he detailed each instance of Harold and Patricia's interference with his college applications, scholarship opportunities, and support systems. "They contacted my guidance counselor to suggest I had learning disabilities," Tyler read. "They called university admissions offices to claim I had misrepresented my volunteer work. They spread rumors about my character to teachers, counselors, and anyone else who might have advocated for my success." The silence in the ballroom was complete now, with nearly 50 people gathered around our group, listening to Tyler's methodical presentation of evidence. I could see Harold and Patricia calculating whether to deny the accusations or attempt damage control. They also intercepted gifts and money that family members sent to support my education. Tyler continued, nodding toward Diana, while telling those relatives that I was too ashamed of my failures to accept their help. Diana stepped forward and addressed the crowd directly. I sent Tyler over $2,000 in birthday and Christmas gifts over the past 3 years, she announced. Harold and Patricia accepted the money on his behalf and told me he was too embarrassed about his academic struggles to respond personally. Uncle James moved to stand beside Diana, his voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. They told me Tyler was struggling with substance abuse and needed family intervention rather than support for his educational goals. Aunt Sharon joined them, holding up printed prayer requests from Patricia's church group. They used our weekly prayer circle to spread lies about Tyler's supposed emotional problems and academic dishonesty. The systematic exposure of Harold and Patricia's manipulation was having exactly the effect I had hoped for. I could see shock and disgust replacing curiosity on the faces of their friends and business associates. But here's what they didn't want anyone to know about Tyler's actual achievements, I said, stepping forward with my own folder of documentation. I began reading from Tyler's transcripts his perfect GPA, while working 60 hours per week, his acceptance letters to multiple universities, with scholarship offers, his volunteer work at the animal shelter, and his tutoring of struggling classmates. Tyler graduated valedictorian of a class of 400 students, I announced to the shocked crowd. He scored in the 98th percentile on his SAT. He's been accepted to multiple medical school prerequisite programs and has been working 3 jobs to support his education without burdening his family financially. The contrast between Tyler's actual achievements and the narrative Harold and Patricia had been spreading was so stark that several people were shaking their heads in disbelief. Tyler chose community college not because he couldn't get into prestigious universities, but because he researched the most financially responsible path to medical school. I continued. He wanted to graduate debt-free so he could focus on helping patients rather than paying back loans. Mrs. Chen from my parents' country club stepped forward, her face flushed with embarrassment. Patricia, you told me Tyler had failed his college entrance exams. You said he was considering trade school because academics were too challenging for him. More voices joined in as people began sharing the lies they had been told about Tyler's supposed failures and limitations. You told our church group he was in counseling for emotional problems, added Mrs. Patterson from Patricia's prayer circle. You said he had been caught cheating at school, contributed Mr. Davis, one of Harold's business associates. The accumulation of contradictory lies was creating exactly the effect we had hoped for. Harold and Patricia's credibility was crumbling in real time as their own social network began to understand how extensively they had been manipulated. Tyler stepped forward again, his voice now carrying the quiet confidence of someone who knew he was speaking truth to a receptive audience. I want everyone here to understand that I'm not sharing this information to embarrass my grandparents or to seek sympathy, he said clearly. I'm sharing it because I believe family members should support each other's dreams and celebrate each other's achievements. He paused, looking directly at Harold and Patricia for the first time since beginning his presentation. I also want you to know that despite everything they did to try to destroy my confidence and limit my opportunities, I am still planning to become a doctor, Tyler announced with quiet determination. I will graduate from medical school, and I will spend my career helping people who are suffering. The applause that erupted from the crowd was spontaneous and sustained, with people turning to shake Tyler's hand and offer congratulations on his achievements and resilience. But the most devastating moment came when Brad appeared at the edge of the crowd, his face streaked with tears and his voice shaking with emotion. Tyler, I need to apologize to you in front of everyone, Brad said, his words carrying clearly across the now silent ballroom. Everything my grandparents said about your failures was a lie, but everything they said about my success was also a lie. The admission hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. I'm failing at Yale. Brad continued, his voice breaking with emotion. I've been on academic probation twice, and my parents have been bribing professors and administrators to keep me enrolled. The crowd's shocked silence was broken only by Patricia's sharp intake of breath as she realized that their golden child was about to destroy their carefully constructed narrative completely. Tyler, you're everything they said I was. Brad said, looking directly at his cousin with admiration and regret. "You're smart, hardworking, responsible, and honest. I'm the actual disappointment in this family, but they used you as a scapegoat to hide my failures." The revelation that the family's golden child was actually the failure, while Tyler had been punished for imaginary inadequacies, was the final piece of evidence needed to completely discredit Harold and Patricia's judgment and character. As the crowd began to understand the full scope of the manipulation and lies, I watched my parents' social standing crumble in real time. And I realized that justice was finally being served. The silence following Brad's confession was deafening, broken only by the soft sound of champagne bubbles rising in forgotten glasses and the distant music from the adjacent cocktail reception. Patricia's face had gone completely white, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the shock and horror in her eyes, as she realized that her perfect grandson had just destroyed the last remnant of their credibility. Harold stepped forward, his voice tight with barely controlled fury as he attempted damage control. "Brad, you're upset and not thinking clearly," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "There's no need to make dramatic statements that you'll regret later." But Brad shook his head firmly, pulling out his phone and showing the screen to the gathered crowd. "These are my grades from Yale." He announced, his voice gaining strength as he chose honesty over self-preservation. 2 Ds, 1 F, and a C-. I'm on academic probation and facing suspension if I don't improve dramatically next semester. The crowd leaned in to see the evidence, their murmurs of surprise turning to exclamations of shock as they realized that the golden child they had been hearing about for years was actually struggling academically while Tyler excelled. "Brad, stop!" Patricia hissed, her social mask completely abandoned as she grabbed for his phone. "You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying, Grandma," Brad replied, pulling away from her reach. "I'm saying that you and Grandpa have been lying about both of us for years." Diana stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "How long have you known about Tyler's real achievements?" she asked Brad directly. Brad looked ashamed as he answered, "I've always known Tyler was smarter than me. When we were kids, he helped me with my homework because I couldn't understand the material. In high school, he tutored me in math and science so I could pass my classes." The admission that Tyler had been helping Brad academically while being publicly dismissed as intellectually inferior was like a slap across Harold and Patricia's faces. "My parents have been paying for tutors' test prep courses and even bribing admissions counselors to get me into programs I didn't qualify for." Brad continued, his confession becoming more devastating with each revelation. "They told me it was necessary because I had to maintain the family's reputation for excellence." Uncle James stepped forward, his voice filled with disgust. "You mean they've been committing fraud to cover up Brad's academic problems while destroying Tyler's legitimate opportunities?" "Yes," Brad said simply, "and they told me that if I didn't go along with it, they would cut off my funding and I'd end up like Tyler, struggling at community college and disappointing the family." The systematic manipulation was becoming even clearer as Brad revealed how Harold and Patricia had used fear and financial control to maintain their lies. "They made me participate in humiliating Tyler on Christmas Eve." Brad added, his voice breaking with emotion. "They said it was necessary to teach him a lesson about accepting reality. But the reality is that Tyler's path is more honest and ultimately more successful than anything I've achieved." Mrs. Henderson from my parents' social circle stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "Patricia, you've been telling us for months about Brad's academic achievements at Yale," she said accusingly. "You showed us awards and recognition letters that apparently weren't real." "They were real," Patricia said desperately, her voice high and strained. "Brad has been very successful at Yale. He's just having a temporary setback." "Grandma, stop lying," Brad said firmly. "Those awards were from high school. You've been showing people my old achievements and pretending they were current." Robert, Diana's husband, stepped forward with his forensic accountant's precision for details. "What about the money that was supposed to be supporting Tyler's education?" he asked Harold directly. "Diana alone sent over $2,000. How much money from how many relatives was diverted to cover Brad's expenses? Harold's jaw worked silently for several seconds before he managed to respond. Any money received on behalf of family members was used for family purposes. That's theft, Robert replied bluntly. You accepted money under false pretenses and used it for unauthorized purposes. Uncle James pulled out his phone and began scrolling through his messages. I sent $500 last year when Patricia told me Tyler needed help with medical expenses, he announced. She said he was struggling with depression and substance abuse treatment. More family members began checking their phones and purses, pulling out records of money and gifts they had sent for Tyler's benefit over the past 2 years. I sent $300 for his birthday, Aunt Sharon added. Patricia said he was grateful but too ashamed to respond personally. $250 for Christmas, contributed Cousin Michelle, who had apparently arrived during Tyler's presentation, with a note specifically asking that it be used for his college expenses. The total amount of intercepted money was growing quickly, and I could see Harold and Patricia calculating the potential legal consequences as the evidence of their theft accumulated. But the financial fraud was only part of their crumbling reputation. Mr. Davis, one of Harold's most important business associates, stepped forward with a grim expression. Harold, you've been using Tyler's situation as an example of poor family values in our business discussions, he said coldly. You told me that modern parents were too permissive and that Tyler's failures prove the importance of maintaining high standards. You used my grandson as a cautionary tale, James added, his voice filled with disgust, while he was actually excelling academically and working harder than most adults. Mrs. Chen from the country club shook her head in bewilderment. Patricia, you organized a prayer group specifically to ask for divine intervention in Tyler's academic problems that didn't exist. You made us complicit in your lies, added Mrs. Patterson from the church group. We've been praying for Tyler to overcome substance abuse and emotional instability while he was actually maintaining perfect grades and working multiple jobs. The systematic exposure of Harold and Patricia's manipulation was creating exactly the effect we had hoped for. Their entire social network was beginning to understand how extensively they had been used to spread lies and justify cruelty. Tyler stepped forward again, his voice calm and measured as he addressed the crowd. I want everyone to understand that my grandparents' lies didn't just hurt me, he said clearly. They hurt everyone who cared enough to send support, everyone who wasted time praying for problems that didn't exist, and everyone who was manipulated into participating in my exclusion and humiliation. The moral clarity of Tyler's statement resonated with the crowd, many of whom were beginning to look at Harold and Patricia with expressions of disgust rather than shock. They turned our family's love and concern into weapons against me, Tyler continued. They used your kindness and generosity to fund their deception while making you believe you were helping someone who was too proud or ashamed to appreciate your support. Diana stepped forward and addressed the crowd directly. How many of you sent money or gifts for Tyler that you never heard about again? Nearly a dozen hands went up representing family members and family friends who had been manipulated into unknowingly funding Harold and Patricia's lies. How many of you were told stories about Tyler's problems that never quite made sense with what you knew about his character? Diana continued. Even more hands went up as people began to recognize the inconsistencies they had noticed but dismissed. And how many of you have been repeating Harold and Patricia's stories to other people, spreading lies without realizing it? Diana asked. The forest of raised hands was the final evidence needed to demonstrate the scope of Harold and Patricia's manipulation campaign. Mr. Rodriguez, the country club's general manager, approached our group with obvious concern about the disruption to the evening's festivities. Perhaps we should move this discussion to a more private setting, he suggested diplomatically. Actually, Tyler said clearly, I think we're finished here. He turned to face Harold and Patricia directly for the first time since his presentation began. Grandpa, Harold, Grandma, Patricia, you spent 2 years trying to convince me that I wasn't good enough for this family, Tyler said quietly. Tonight you've shown everyone here that it's actually the opposite. The simple dignity of Tyler's statement was more devastating than any angry accusation could have been. You're not good enough for me. Tyler continued, his voice filled with quiet strength. And you're not good enough for any of the people who trusted you with their love, their money, and their good intentions. With that, Tyler turned and began walking toward the ballroom exit, followed immediately by Diana, Robert James, Carol Sharon, and a growing procession of family members who had chosen truth over comfortable denial. I paused at the edge of the crowd and looked back at Harold and Patricia, who stood frozen in the center of a circle of people who were no longer looking at them with respect and admiration. "Enjoy your reputation," I said simply, and followed my son toward the door. Behind us, I could hear the murmur of shocked conversations beginning as 200 of the community's most prominent citizens processed what they had just witnessed. Harold and Patricia had spent decades building their social standing and business relationships through careful cultivation of their image as successful, principled people with high family values. In the space of 30 minutes, Tyler had destroyed all of that work with nothing but the truth. And as we walked out into the cold January air, I realized that justice had been served more completely than I had ever dared to hope. The weeks following the New Year's Eve confrontation brought swift and comprehensive consequences for Harold and Patricia that exceeded even my most optimistic expectations for justice. By January 5th, the story of their systematic manipulation had spread throughout their social and professional networks with the kind of viral intensity that only comes from a scandal involving respected community members. Harold's construction business began hemorrhaging clients almost immediately. Mr. Davis, his most important business associate, called personally to inform him that their partnership was being terminated due to fundamental concerns about character and judgment. 3 other major clients followed suit within the week, citing loss of confidence in Harold's integrity and professionalism. The construction industry depends on trust and reputation. Mr. Davis explained when he called to give me an update on the business fallout. When someone demonstrates that level of dishonesty in their personal relationships, it raises serious questions about their professional ethics. The domino effect continued as Harold's remaining clients began requesting detailed audits of their projects and withholding payments pending review. Within 2 weeks, Brennan Construction LLC was facing a cash flow crisis that threatened immediate bankruptcy. Patricia's social destruction was equally swift and thorough. The country club board called an emergency meeting to discuss her continued membership, ultimately deciding that her conduct reflected poorly on the organization's values and standards. Her resignation was strongly encouraged and swiftly accepted. The church situation was particularly devastating for Patricia, who had built her entire social identity around her standing in the religious community. When the full scope of her prayer circle manipulation became known, the pastoral council requested a private meeting to address concerns about her misuse of sacred community practices for personal vendettas. Mrs. Patterson, who had been leading the prayer group that Patricia manipulated, called me personally to express her outrage and apologize for unknowingly participating in Tyler's emotional abuse. "We spend our time praying for people who are genuinely suffering," she told me, her voice tight with anger. To discover that Patricia was manufacturing crises and exploiting our compassion for her own twisted purposes feels like a violation of everything our faith community stands for. Patricia was quietly asked to find a new church home, ending 30 years of involvement in the organization that had been central to her social life and sense of identity. But the most satisfying consequence came from an unexpected source: the extended family's collective decision to redirect their support toward Tyler and away from Harold and Patricia entirely. Uncle James had taken the lead in organizing what he called Operation Tyler Support, reaching out to every family member who had been manipulated over the past 2 years and coordinating a comprehensive response. "We've been enablers," James told me during one of our planning calls. "We let Harold and Patricia get away with this abuse because we didn't want to rock the boat or cause family drama. but our silence made us complicit in Tyler's suffering. The family response was overwhelming and immediate. Diana increased her educational support to cover Tyler's entire medical school tuition when the time came. James offered to pay for Tyler's MCAT preparation course and medical school application fees. Aunt Sharon established a monthly stipend to help with Tyler's living expenses so he could reduce his work hours and focus more on his studies. Even relatives I barely knew emerged from the woodwork to offer support and apologize for believing Harold and Patricia's lies. Cousin Michael drove 4 hours to personally deliver a check and express his regret for not questioning the inconsistencies he had noticed in their stories about Tyler. "Your son is obviously brilliant and hardworking," Michael told me. "I should have trusted my own judgment instead of accepting Harold's assessment of his capabilities." The financial support was helpful, but the emotional validation was transformative for Tyler. For the first time in years, he was surrounded by family members who celebrated his achievements and supported his dreams, rather than trying to convince him they were unrealistic. "It's like I can finally breathe," Tyler told me one evening as we reviewed acceptance letters from medical school prerequisite programs. "I spent so long doubting myself and trying to prove I was worthy of family love. Now I realize the problem was never with me." The academic opportunities that began opening up for Tyler were equally gratifying. Mrs. Rodriguez, his high school guidance counselor, had contacted several universities to explain the family interference that had led to Tyler's scholarship withdrawals. 2 schools immediately reinstated their original offers, and a third offered an even more generous package based on Tyler's community college performance. Tyler's case has become an example we use in our counselor training, Mrs. Rodriguez told me. "We now have protocols for identifying and documenting family sabotage so we can better protect students from this kind of manipulation." The Regional Medical Center, learning about Tyler's story through their connection to his volunteer work, offered him a paid research assistant position that would provide valuable experience while helping fund his education. "We need more students like Tyler in medicine," the program director explained. "Someone who has overcome significant obstacles and maintained both academic excellence and personal integrity would be a valuable addition to any medical program." By February, Tyler was not just back on track with his original goals, but was actually in a stronger position than he had been before Harold and Patricia's interference. The public vindication of his character and abilities had opened doors that might never have been available otherwise. Meanwhile, Harold and Patricia's isolation from the family and community was becoming increasingly complete. Mark and Jennifer, perhaps recognizing which way the wind was blowing, had quietly distanced themselves from his parents and begun making overtures toward reconciliation with Tyler and me. "We should have spoken up sooner," Jennifer admitted during an awkward coffee meeting in mid-February. "We knew Harold and Patricia were being unfair to Tyler, but we didn't realize how systematic and deliberate their campaign was." Mark nodded uncomfortably. "We were afraid of becoming their next targets if we challenged them. But that fear doesn't excuse our silence while they destroyed Tyler's opportunities." Their apologies felt inadequate given their complicity in Tyler's suffering, but their willingness to acknowledge their mistakes was more than Harold and Patricia had offered. Brad's situation had become increasingly complicated as the full scope of his academic fraud came to light. Yale had launched an investigation into his parents' bribes and was considering both academic sanctions and potential criminal charges. Brad himself was cooperating fully with the investigation, apparently determined to break free from his parents' manipulation and build an honest foundation for his future. "I want to start over," Brad told Tyler during one of their reconciliation conversations. "I want to earn my achievements legitimately, even if that means transferring to a less prestigious school and accepting that I'm not the brilliant student my parents pretended I was." Tyler's response to Brad's situation demonstrated the kind of maturity and compassion that made Harold and Patricia's assessment of his character so obviously wrong. "And the important thing is that you're being honest now," Tyler told his cousin. "It takes courage to admit mistakes and choose integrity over convenience." The contrast between Tyler's gracious response to Brad's fraud and Harold and Patricia's vicious reaction to Tyler's legitimate choices could not have been more stark. By March, the legal consequences of Harold and Patricia's actions were beginning to materialize. Robert Diana's forensic accountant husband had compiled a comprehensive case documenting the theft of money intended for Tyler's education. The total amount exceeded $6,000, enough to qualify for felony charges in our state. The pattern of deception and the systematic nature of the fraud make this a serious criminal matter, Robert explained. They didn't just steal money. They created an elaborate scheme to justify and conceal their theft over a period of years. Several family members were considering filing charges, but Tyler ultimately requested that we pursue civil rather than criminal remedies. "I don't want to send my grandparents to prison," Tyler told me. "I just want them to return the money they stole and acknowledge what they did wrong." Tyler's compassion toward people who had shown him no mercy was remarkable, but it was also strategically wise. The threat of criminal prosecution gave us significant leverage in demanding both financial restitution and public acknowledgement of their misconduct. Harold and Patricia, facing complete social isolation, financial ruin, and potential criminal charges, finally agreed to mediated settlement discussions in late March. The mediation session was held in a neutral conference room with a professional mediator facilitating the conversation. Harold and Patricia arrived looking significantly older and more frail than they had just 3 months earlier, the stress and isolation having taken a visible toll on both of them. "We want to find a way forward that works for everyone," the mediator began diplomatically. But Tyler was no longer interested in finding compromises with people who had spent years systematically destroying his opportunities and confidence. "I want them to return every penny they stole," Tyler said clearly. "I want them to send written apologies to every person they lied to about me. And I want them to acknowledge publicly that their assessment of my capabilities and character was completely wrong." Harold started to object, but their attorney quickly advised him that Tyler's demands were reasonable, given the strength of the evidence against them. The final settlement required Harold and Patricia to pay full restitution for the intercepted gifts and stolen money right individual apology letters to 17 different people who had been fed lies about Tyler, and publish a public statement in the local newspaper acknowledging their misconduct and correcting the false narratives they had spread. Most importantly, they were required to have no contact with Tyler for a minimum of 2 years, giving him space to heal from their abuse and build his future without their interference. "This isn't about punishment," Tyler explained to the mediator. "It's about ensuring that I can pursue my goals without fear of sabotage and that other family members can support me without being manipulated by lies." As we left the mediation session, I realized that Tyler had achieved something remarkable. He had not just survived his grandparents' systematic abuse, he had used their cruelty as motivation to build an even stronger foundation for his future. Harold and Patricia had tried to convince Tyler that he was inadequate and delusional. Instead, they had created a young man with unshakable confidence in his own worth and crystal clear understanding of the difference between genuine support and manipulative control. Their attempt to destroy him had ultimately made him stronger, wiser, and more determined than he might have been otherwise. And that, I realized, was the most perfect justice of all. 6 months after that devastating Christmas Eve confrontation, I stood in the auditorium of Tyler's community college, watching my son deliver the valedictorian speech to a graduating class of 800 students. He looked confident and mature in his cap and gown, every inch the successful young man Harold and Patricia had tried to convince him he could never become. Excellence isn't about where you start your journey. Tyler told his fellow graduates, his voice carrying clearly across the packed auditorium. It's about the integrity, determination, and compassion you bring to every step of that journey. I found myself thinking about how different this moment felt from Tyler's high school graduation, when Harold and Patricia had attended, but spent the entire ceremony making subtle comments about Tyler's modest college plans compared to Brad's prestigious university acceptance. Now Tyler was speaking to an audience that included admissions representatives from 3 medical schools, all of whom were eager to recruit him for their programs. Diana, who had become Tyler's unofficial surrogate grandmother, was sitting beside me with tears of pride streaming down her face. Uncle James and Aunt Carol occupied the row behind us, along with 6 other family members who had driven hours to celebrate Tyler's achievement. "Look at that boy shine," James whispered to me as Tyler concluded his speech to thunderous applause. "Harold and Patricia must be eating their hearts out knowing what they threw away." The contrast between this celebration and the toxic family dynamics we had escaped was remarkable. Tyler was surrounded by people who genuinely loved and supported him, people who celebrated his success without reservation or jealousy. After the ceremony, Tyler was immediately surrounded by well-wishers and congratulatory handshakes. The regional medical center director offered him a summer internship that would provide valuable clinical experience. 2 medical school admissions counselors handed him their business cards and invited him to schedule campus visits. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had become one of Tyler's strongest advocates, pulled me aside during the reception. "I've been a guidance counselor for 15 years, she told me, "and I've never seen a student overcome such systematic family sabotage with such grace and determination. Tyler is going to make an exceptional doctor." The acknowledgement that Tyler had overcome systematic family sabotage rather than personal inadequacy felt like final validation of everything we had endured and fought against. As the celebrations wound down and we prepared to leave campus, Tyler and I took a quiet moment to reflect on how dramatically our lives had changed since Christmas Eve. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't fought back?" Tyler asked as we walked across the campus, where he had spent 2 years proving his academic excellence. I thought about the question seriously. If we had accepted Harold and Patricia's assessment of Tyler's limitations, if we had allowed their manipulation to continue unchallenged, Tyler might have enrolled in trade school and abandoned his medical dreams entirely. "I think you would have eventually realized your own worth and fought your way back to your goals," I told him honestly. "But it might have taken years longer and cost you opportunities that couldn't be recovered." Tyler nodded thoughtfully. "The thing that scares me most is how close I came to believing them. If you hadn't recorded that presentation and shown me the evidence of their lies, I might have convinced myself that their assessment was accurate." The systematic nature of Harold and Patricia's psychological manipulation had been so sophisticated that even Tyler's exceptional intelligence and strong character had not been enough to protect him from their influence. It had taken external validation and documented evidence to break their hold on his self-perception. "What did you learn from this experience?" I asked, genuinely curious about Tyler's perspective on the ordeal. "I learned that love should never require you to minimize yourself or abandon your dreams," Tyler replied immediately. "Real family support means celebrating each other's success, not demanding conformity to arbitrary standards." He paused, considering his words carefully before continuing. "I also learned that some people will use emotional manipulation to control others, and the only effective response is to document the truth and expose the manipulation publicly," Tyler added. "Trying to reason with manipulative people or hoping they'll change on their own is just enabling their behavior." The maturity and insight in Tyler's analysis reminded me again why Harold and Patricia's assessment of his intellectual capabilities had been so absurdly wrong. But most importantly, Tyler concluded, "I learned that my worth as a person isn't determined by other people's opinions, even if those people are family members who claim to love me." As we drove home from Tyler's graduation, I reflected on how this experience had changed both of us in fundamental ways. For 37 years, I had been trapped in patterns of seeking approval from people who used that approval as a weapon to control and manipulate me. I had taught Tyler to absorb criticism and doubt himself rather than recognizing that the criticism itself was the problem. But fighting for Tyler had taught me that protection sometimes requires confrontation, that love sometimes demands choosing difficult truths over comfortable lies, and that enabling toxic behavior is not actually kindness. "What about you, Mom?" Tyler asked, apparently following a similar line of thought. "What did you learn from all this?" I considered the question as we passed the country club where we had publicly confronted Harold and Patricia 6 months earlier. I learned that I spent decades trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it unconditionally, I admitted. And I learned that protecting you required me to stop prioritizing their comfort over your well-being. The realization that my parents' love had always been conditional and manipulative was painful, but ultimately liberating. I no longer felt obligated to maintain relationships that required me to sacrifice my son's happiness and success. I also learned that you don't have to accept toxic treatment just because it comes from family members, I added. Blood relationships don't give people permission to abuse or manipulate you. Tyler nodded in understanding. "Do you think Harold and Patricia will ever acknowledge what they did wrong?" I thought about the court-mandated apology letters Harold and Patricia had been required to write, which had been technically compliant with the legal settlement, but had lacked any genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing or remorse. "I think they'll always believe they were trying to help you by lowering your expectations," I said honestly. "Some people are so invested in their narrative of superiority that they can't admit when they're fundamentally wrong about someone." As we pulled into our driveway, I noticed an envelope in our mailbox with Tyler's name written in elegant handwriting I didn't recognize. Tyler opened the envelope and read the contents, his face breaking into a wide smile. "It's from the Dean of Students at Regional Medical School," Tyler announced with excitement. "They're offering me a full academic scholarship plus a research stipend. They want me to start in their accelerated program this fall." The irony was perfect. Tyler had been accepted to a more prestigious medical program with better financial support than he would have received if Harold and Patricia had never interfered with his original university plans. Their attempt to limit his opportunities had ultimately led to greater success than he might have achieved otherwise. "There's also a note from Brad," Tyler added, pulling out a second piece of paper. "He's transferring to State University and starting over as a freshman. He says he wants to earn his way into medical school, legitimately following my example." The contrast between Tyler's genuine achievement and Brad's manufactured success had apparently motivated real positive change in his cousin's life. As we settled into our living room to celebrate Tyler's acceptance to medical school, I felt a sense of peace and completion that I had never experienced before. Tyler was surrounded by people who genuinely supported his dreams and celebrated his success. He had opportunities that reflected his actual capabilities, rather than artificial limitations imposed by manipulative family members. Most importantly, he had unshakable confidence in his own worth and clear understanding of the difference between genuine love and conditional acceptance. "You know what the best part is," Tyler said as he reread his acceptance letter. "I'm going to be Dr. Tyler Martin, not because I proved anyone wrong, but because I stayed true to what I knew I was capable of achieving." The distinction was important. Tyler's success was not about defeating Harold and Patricia or proving their assessment wrong. It was about refusing to let their manipulation define his potential and pursuing his goals with integrity and determination. "I'm proud of you," I told my son, and I meant it completely. Tyler had faced systematic psychological manipulation, family sabotage, and deliberate attempts to destroy his confidence and opportunities. He had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. But more than that, he had maintained his compassion, his integrity, and his capacity for forgiveness, even toward people who had shown him no mercy. "I'm proud of us both," Tyler replied, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "We protected each other, and we didn't let them destroy what we knew was true about ourselves." As I looked around our modest living room, thinking about the journey that had brought us to this moment, I realized that we had gained something far more valuable than Harold and Patricia's approval. We had gained the certainty that our love for each other was unconditional, that our support was genuine, and that our family bond was strong enough to withstand any external pressure or manipulation. Tyler would go on to medical school, graduate with honors, and become the kind of doctor who changed lives through skill, compassion, and dedication. He would build relationships based on mutual respect rather than power and control, and he would never allow anyone to convince him that his dreams were unrealistic or inappropriate. But even more importantly, Tyler had learned that his worth as a person was not dependent on anyone else's opinion, that genuine love required no sacrifices of dignity or integrity, and that protecting the people you care about sometimes meant confronting those who sought to harm them. Harold and Patricia had tried to teach Tyler that he was inadequate and delusional. Instead, they had taught him that he was strong, capable, and worthy of unconditional love and support. Their greatest failure had become our greatest victory. And as Tyler began planning for medical school and I began planning for the first Christmas in years, where we would be surrounded only by people who truly loved and supported us, I realized that sometimes the most valuable life lessons come from the people who teach us exactly what we don't want to become. What would you do if family members were sabotaging your dreams while claiming to love you? Have you ever had to choose between family approval and protecting someone you care about? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you so much for listening to Tyler's story and our journey from manipulation to freedom. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe for more real-life stories about family dynamics and personal growth, and share this with anyone who might need to hear that their dreams are valid, regardless of what others might say. Remember, genuine love celebrates your success, supports your goals, and never requires you to make yourself smaller to make others feel bigger. You deserve relationships that build you up rather than tear you down. Wishing you all the courage to pursue your dreams and surround yourselves with people who truly want to see you succeed.